the network of folks, and you can see here, I believe that we actually circled the people who will be speaking today. Oh, no, go ahead. No, that's fine. Kamika's actually the one in charge of this network and transitioning over, so you know a lot more about that. You can go ahead. I'll let you go.
Anything else?
No, that's it.
All right. So thank you, everyone, for being here, and then thanks to Jennie Grammer from UCLA, who's the PI on the co-PI on the UCLA site with Marcelo, who organized the symposium. So thank you very much. So I'm Fumiko Haft. I'm now the co-director of the University of California Stanford Precision Learning Center. I also wanted to welcome you here as well. There's many people calling in from remotely, so we're very grateful for all of you for being here. We're also grateful to our sponsors, International Mind, Brain, and Education Society, as well as the president, Mary Helen Imardino-Young, who helped coordinate to get this going, as well as the Brain Creativity Institute and director of BCI, Antonio Damasio, who helped us get this place and sponsor this. And of course, as well as the UC Office of the President, who sponsors our center and this conference. So as you can see, we have a remarkable lineup of speakers that you saw on the past slide. Maybe I'll just go back. And students presenting today in the field of mind, brain, and education from Berkeley. Well, actually, first, Jennie Grammer will be speaking from UCLA, and then Terry Jernigan from UC San Diego, and she's on her way over here, and from UC Berkeley, Silvia Bunge, as well as some students. So there's some people who overlap in giving keynotes and talks also at the IMBES main conference, but we asked them to talk about topics that are non-overlapping, and they have graciously agreed to do so. So just some housekeeping items for those calling in remotely in particular. Please mute yourself. We do have it automatically go to mute whenever it's, but please, if it goes unmute or if you have something to say, please do, but please mute yourself whenever possible, and we'll control it remotely as well. We will be recording, or right now we're recording this conference, so every time the speaker comes, we'll check in as well, but if they do agree, we'll make it available later on. And if you experience problems remotely, please just put in your message in the chat box. So I know many of you might have heard of this center, but especially the internal people, but I just wanted to introduce you a little bit to talk about Precision Learning Center. It started in 2017 when we received an award from the UC Office of the President, Multi-Research Program Initiative, MRPI, to establish this virtual center across UC campuses, and then later on Stanford joined as well. So includes from UCSF myself, Roland Hancock, who used to be at UCSF, who's now assistant professor at University of Connecticut, and he is he's associate director of the Brain Imaging Research Center, or BERC there. Jeffrey Gilger, he's a professor at UC Merced, and he's in charge of training. Professor Carol Connor, she is from UC Irvine, and she's an expert in literacy instruction. Jamal Jabadi, we have remotely calling in from UC Davis, and he's an expert in English learners as well as policy. And then Jennifer Grammer, but I'll introduce her again when she starts her talk. Melina Uncapher, she's at the training session for IMBES, so she'll be joining us later, but she has taken over as co-director since I moved to University of Connecticut. So right now, in the past month, I moved to University of Connecticut as professor of psychological sciences, as well as keeping my position as adjunct here at UCSF, and I direct the Brain Imaging Research Center, or BERC. Silvia Bunge is another speaker. She's an expert in cognitive neuroscience, as you know, and intimately involved in IMBES as well as other mind, brain, and education initiatives. Bruce McCandless is not here right now. He's from Stanford School of Education, and he is part of our network as well as Marcelo Suarez Orozco, is that right? The Dean of School of Education from UCSF, and he studies diverse learners, and he is part of our network as well. Let's see, and Melina I'll introduce more when she comes, and she will be closing the symposium. So the mission of Precision Learning Center is to tackle education and health disparity in California and across the US through science-based innovation. And our short-term goal is to use cognitive science principles to help identify children for learning difficulties, in particular dyslexia, in underserved populations with a particular emphasis on English learners. It's a national issue. There's about 10% of the public school children are now English learners throughout the United States. If you go to the Bay Area, it's over 25% now. We have 4 primary pillars to our center, or these are the expertise that we cover anywhere from neuroscience to psychology, education, medicine, and policy. And our goal is to really start linking precision kind of education approaches to precision medicine type approaches. So we have 4 primary pillars to our center, which we call the STAR model, and this is kind of taken from, there's an amazing UCSF clinic or program called the STAR Clinic for Autism at UCSF. And so we're kind of following the same model, which I absolutely love. So services for S, training, T for training, A for advocacy, and R for research. The University of California Office of the President is particularly interested in the training of faculty and students across campuses, and this is one of our activities as well as intercampus research. So this conference, as well as the recently awarded Catalyst Award to, let's see, I am going off a little bit. So for services, we do professional development, offer science classes to schools, field trips, and internships. For training, we aim to train the next generation of multidisciplinary faculty and students, including conferences that we hold, and we'll tell you a little bit about our accomplishments so far. And we also provide grants to the UC campuses students and research assistants. Advocacy and policy, and then as well as research. Our goal again is early identification of learning challenges in the underserved, particularly in English language learners. In terms of grants, we provided in 2 forms, a Catalyst Award, which is done annually for students and research assistants because most of them are going off to graduate school, and I feel like there's very little opportunities for them to apply for grants at that stage to conduct and learn about multidisciplinary multi-campus research. And then we offer support to conferences held within the UC campuses for students and research assistants to attend conferences. So we host other conferences as well. We support the food and other expenses, and then we send students for their travel to go to other conferences. So accomplishment to date, just briefly, we've held about 12 conferences and meetings so far, supported them. Catalyst Award, which we started this year in year 2, the first awardee is UC San Francisco, Stephanie Hoft, and co-investigator Megan Chang. And then there's partial funding went to UCLA, Sonia Jamani, and UC Merced, Annabelle Castillo, and we'll be hearing from some of them today, or you'll see posters at the IMBES conference. In terms of research, some are ongoing and some are we hope to do over the next year. So Precision Learning Executive Function Assessment app, R&D as well as validation. This is primarily done so far between the UC, Melina Uncapher and our group, and we recently got a couple $1 million of funding to extend this research from a foundation. We also are looking at the links between social emotional status, stress biomarkers using hair cortisol and other measures, obesity and cognitive abilities, and you'll see a poster at this conference. There's a National Science Foundation Science of Learning Collaborative Network, which is led by Melina Uncapher, which is done between UC San Francisco, UC Berkeley, and Stanford. And it's going to end tomorrow, but we're hoping to support some of those so we can continue analyzing the rich amount of data, and perhaps you might talk about that later in the closing remarks. And hopefully capitalizing on some of the expertise that we have, such as from Jennie. We are hoping to do, and we have raised some funds, but we're hoping to do more in-school EEG. And Terry Jernigan's group at UC San Diego, Tim Brown and others have been doing a lot of work in this area as well. So we hope that there might be some collaborative opportunities. So I think that's it. And with this, I wanted to introduce Jennie. Many of you may know her already. But so Dr. Jennie Grammer is Assistant Professor of Education at UCLA and Director of the BEAR Lab, it's a cute name, Brain Education Affect Regulation Lab. She has a PhD in Developmental Psychology from University of North Carolina, from Chapel Hill, and did her postdoc in the same lab as Carol Connor, who's also a co-PI on this, and then her mentor is here, Fred. Jennie explores changes in children's cognitive skills from early childhood across the transition to elementary school and the contexts that promote this growth. She employs both behavioral and neurobiological methods such as EEG to examine the development of executive functions, memory, and metacognition between the ages of 3 to 8. In addition, she works to identify aspects of the classroom and home environment that promotes this development. So when I first heard her speak, which was a symposium that Fred organized in Chicago, I was running late again and I was sweating, and I walked in and I heard her talk and I thought it was pretty remarkable. That whole symposium was really remarkable, with people who really cared about the translation and integration between education, the science of learning, and cognitive neuroscience. And she's one of the leaders in this field, and she gives great talks, no pressure, but so we will be hearing from her, and we're excited that she joined the Precision Learning Center initiative, and so thank you, and thank you for organizing today.
Yeah. Okay, so kicking things off, I can see like none of the people right up at the top, which is funny because I feel like this is also kind of an intimate space. Let me go ahead and I'm gonna end this show and start my own. Just 1 second. Is thinking really carefully, apparently, about this. Aha. Okay, so actually, I think, Famika, you already gave most of my talk, my whole intro about what I do. But I'll rehash some of that. Today, I'm going to be talking about trying to weave together. Some of you all have heard me speak at the previous Preckle group meeting that we had in the spring, so some of this may be a little bit redundant. But what I'm doing here today is I'm trying to weave it together in a slightly different way to tell you about both the work that I've been doing at UCLA and with collaborators at University of Michigan, thank you, Fred, and others, and then kind of where this work is heading to really push that translational piece. So that setup that you just gave was pretty good in terms of thinking about where we're heading with this talk. You might not have known that. So we're going to be talking about measuring executive functions in the classroom setting in particular, and the different ways that that can be done and why we might want to think about what's actually happening in the classroom versus what happens when I pull a kid out into my lab. Okay, so broadly, my program of research is focused on one main question, which is how it is that experiences that children have in school promote the emergence and refinement of their basic cognitive skills. And so what we can see here is we've got two sets of friends, both at school. On one side, you see some kiddos in pre-K, they're engaged in a learning activity. That looks very different than what we see on the opposite side, which is kiddos that are in 2nd and 3rd grade who are sitting nicely at their desks and doing independent work. Okay, so we know that as children are transitioning from pre-K through early elementary school, there are really rapid changes in their skills for things like memory, metacognition, and executive functioning. And this is in part because of the different types of changes that are going on within the children during this period of time, but it's also because of the types of contexts that kids find themselves in. So not only do we expect kids to be developing these skills during this window, we know that that's going to happen with age, but we're also imposing different structures on children that help them practice potentially those types of skills, or at least expect them to engage in those types of skills. So to examine this question, I take kind of a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary approach. I look at developmental changes in brain and behavior across the school transition. Again, I was trained as a developmental psychologist, so that's kind of where my roots are. And then I also spend time thinking about and observing in classrooms, trying to figure out how to characterize that environment, to assess what factors in the classroom environment might be malleable factors that we could learn about, link them to kids' growth, and then eventually, hopefully, ultimately intervene. Okay. So one of the things that I'm going to do is I'm going to actually take us down a little bit of a road of executive functions. Everybody knows what executive functions are. Everybody has their own internal definition, working definition. We're going to play off of that for a second. And I think that this is important to do in part because we all have different ways that we think about EF. And so I want you to know what I'm talking about, but also recognizing that especially in the field of education, this is a very kind of a large space that people are working in right now. So executive functions are, before I define them, I just want to kind of give a little bit of background. So people have been studying executive functions from a range of different perspectives. Let me just, okay, let's see if this will work better. Aha. So in neuroscience, for many, many years, people have been studying concepts like cognitive control and related structures of cognitive control. In education, people have been studying things like work-related skills, the types of skills you need when you're in the classroom setting or in other types of learning environments. In psychology, we have terms like executive attention and effortful control. And these are all relatively siloed areas of study. Okay, we also have things happening in each of these intersections. So again, here, executive control versus effortful control, or self-regulation, kind of blending between psychology and education. Okay, so we have all of these different disciplines working on the same types of questions about how kids regulate their thinking or their behavior in environment. We then overlay that with emotion, and we have hot and cold skills, so it gets infinitely more complicated. And what it really boils down to is what we're measuring, right? So with each of these different traditions, we also have different modes of measurement that kind of are chief in this subfield. So in neuroscience, in the work that I do, I use electrophysiological methods to understand children's cognitive control. In education, we see a lot of use of parent and teacher report or other observational methods. And in psychology, we have this vast proliferation of individualized tasks that we use with kids, all of which have some pros and some cons. But it's important to kind of have this scope, because one of the things that this also hits on are the questions that are most relevant to each of these disciplines, right? So psychologists are often thinking about what's happening at the level of the child. We care about what's happening over time in those individuals. In educational space, we care about what kids are doing in context. And if we're coming from a neuroscience tradition, we're really caring more about what's happening underneath the hood, okay? So how we measure what we measure is all informed by kind of our basic goals and questions, but we're all trying to get at the same type of thing, executive function. So in my work, I define executive function as cognitive skills utilized for purposeful, future-oriented behavior that underlie flexible adaptation to changing task demands. And these skills include regulation of attention, which I'm sure everybody's doing right now. We're all regulating our attention on this busy day. Inhibiting inappropriate responses, and coordinating information and working memory. There are others, and depending on the model that you work from, you might have other types of things you would add to the list. You might also call them slightly different things. But regardless of what you call them, we think of these skills as being relevant and important for what's happening for kids in school. That's what I care the most about. So, briefly, I'm sure you all probably know this, but why do we care about executive functions? Again, self-regulation, executive functions. I'm trying to stick with executive functions now. I gave a talk to a group of teachers and I got quizzed on the difference between self-regulation and executive function, which I thought was a really great question because it's a hard one to answer. We're sticking with EF for now, focusing on that side of things. So we care about executive functions because we think, and we know actually from research, that they're really relevant for children's school readiness. So if you look at this image here, it's another picture of a bunch of kids in the classroom. There's a lot happening here, right? So this is kindergarten. This is kind of an average kindergarten classroom with multiple centers happening all at the same time. And we have some kids that are very engaged in their activity. This friend here, she's really engaged in what she's making. We don't really know what's happening over here. This child is in transition. Maybe he or she is looking at what a friend is doing, trying to figure out what to do next. Here, same thing. Maybe he's looking at a teacher. Maybe he's just distracted, right? There's a lot of exciting things happening in the classroom. And so there's a lot of reasons to think that executive skills might matter in this space. And in fact, they do. We also know that EF is related to the development of early reading and math skills. This seems to be particularly true, for example, for children who are having difficulties with learning. One of the interesting things that I think has come out recently, or more recently, is this idea that it's not just that EF drives the development of academic skills, but perhaps also that experience reading and experience engaged in mathematical activities those experiences are helping shape kids' attentional skills, for example, as well, right? So it's a bidirectional process. As you're engaged in learning activities, you're also kind of refining your executive system too. Okay. So I've kind of already foreshadowed this idea that we really think about the development of EF in context. It's hard to disentangle it. Again, as a developmentalist, I'm often thinking about developmental changes in children's behavior. I'm also looking at changes in brain activity across early childhood. And I'm separately measuring what's happening in the classroom setting, right? So all of these things are happening kind of all at the same time. When I talk with colleagues who come from more of a neuroscience background, I think the story that you often hear, or at least kind of the research perspective, is that what's happening in your biology is shaping behavior, and that might inform the types of experiences you have in school. If you have attentional difficulties or you're struggling to read, you might be offered different types of opportunities in the classroom. When I talk to teachers and when I stand in classrooms, we often hear the opposite story, which is that you're in school, that's changing your behavior, and that's also changing your brain. And if you've ever spent a lot of time with kindergarten and first graders, you'll often hear them talk about this as an active part of their learning. So I'm like growing my brain. You'll see posters in schools. This is also true, right? Both of these things are actually happening, right, at the same time. So one story doesn't trump the other. But what's really interesting is to think about what's going on at these intersections and for individual children. So those, again, those bidirectional processes. So if you are a child who is in a classroom and you're having a lot of attentional problems, using attention as my common thread today, and it's independent silent reading time, and you are maybe struggling also to read, what do you do during that half hour that you have? Yeah, exactly. And what might happen to you if you get up out of your seat, you're no longer independently silently reading, you're kind of wandering around the classroom. Exactly, or you kind of get set, maybe you sit next to the teacher, or maybe you have, yeah, exactly, different types of things could happen to you. Those experiences, right, that shapes your learning opportunity and kind of keeps spiraling like that. So you might have a teacher that really says, okay, I see this as a problem, let me offer supports, instructional supports to make sure that you have what you need. So during this period of time, you're really able to kind of still engage in academic work. The inverse could also be true. We'd have a child that kind of ends up in a different type of setting, maybe at the principal's office getting in trouble. That's kind of a negative type of scenario, right? In either case, you're having context constantly interacting with the children's behavior, but then again, there's also the biological that's happening underneath all of that. Okay, so we're gonna try and unpack each of these things here. We'll see how far we get. But this is, again, the kind of EF development and context is where we wanna be. But before we get there, I think it's important to kind of go back to this idea of how we measure executive functions. And I won't go into super detail about this. Oh, there we go. Fred and I have a chapter that you all can read on measurement mayhem and conceptual clutter, which I do like to refer to occasionally because it gets tricky when we start talking about all these different measures. But I want to kind of give you a sense of the way that we've been conceptualizing it in our work. So as I mentioned before, in educational work, a lot of people rely on, and so do psychologists, on the use of parent or teacher report. So for attention or shifting, we might ask whether or not a child shows evidence in the classroom or at home of really strong focused attention. For response inhibition, we might ask whether or not a child has difficulty standing still. And for working memory, the classic is always, can children remember multi-step directions? I think a lot of us might struggle with that. I know I do, depending on the day. So parent and teacher reports are great. They give us a lot of very rich information, contextualized information. There are a couple of drawbacks to these types of measures. And there are a couple of recent studies that have demonstrated nicely that teacher report of children's executive function or self-regulation abilities is actually to some extent informed by their perceptions of the child's socioeconomic status. So if you are a child who comes from a poor background, your teacher is more likely potentially to rate you as being less self-regulated, right? This also has implications on for what you're getting in the classroom context. Okay, so there are some limits to these measures, but again, if you're seeing a child every single day, you also have a really great sense of what they're doing in your classroom space or in your home. So we have a host of behavioral measures. These are just some of them. I highlight these because we use them in our longitudinal study we have going on right now. And in the work I'm doing in my lab. For attention shifting, we might use a standardized measure. This one, oops, I needed to invert that, is from the Woodcock-Johnson pair cancellation. The goal here is really just to circle every time you see a ball preceding a dog and do that as much as you can, as fast as you can on a pencil and paper. For response inhibition and for a range of other executive functions, we have this other measure called head, toes, knees, shoulders, which some of you may be familiar with, where you ask a child to touch their head, touch their toes, and then you play a silly game. And so instead of touching the right thing, they touch the opposite. So you say touch your head, they're supposed to touch their toes. This is a challenging task. It also involves shifting and other things, obviously. You can see the faces here. I think this kind of sums it up. We have, I make my undergrads do this in class every year, and it's very funny to watch that process happen. It's frustrating. And then for working memory, a lot of times what we use is a classic digit span task. How many people have done the digit span? Several. Okay, so you might have a sense of your span. Again, you could always take this home, and we're not, I don't think we're trending upwards. At least I'm not anymore in my working memory span. But these are kind of the basic behavioral measures that we use. From these measures, we get accuracy and reaction time as our individual difference measures for kids. And the important thing to note here is that we have a ton of these, right? And they all measure what we think of as, say, working memory, but they also all kind of involve other executive function skills. It's hard to have a task that has directions that doesn't also involve your working memory. So once I've given you directions for a task, you have to remember them for the rest of the task, right? So it's hard to disentangle with our behavioral measures what's happening across these different EFs. We also have some limits in terms of, again, some of these types of measures really have floor effects with certain populations and ceiling effects with the same age kids in a different population. So we're still working out some measurement issues with our behavioral measures as well. So in terms of neural measures, there are also a number of ones that you can use with little kids. We have, for shifting or attention, we have a flanker task, a fish flanker. The goal here is just to look at the central fish and to not pay attention to the fish on either side and tell me which direction the central fish is pointing. And you do that in a very quick way. We kind of force you to move very fast through these tasks. We also have a classic go, no go task where the goal is to press a button when you see certain things, but not when you see other things, right? So these are games where kids are playing very, very quickly. They're moving very, very fast. Here's an in-back task. This is not one that we use with EEG, but I use both of these tasks with electrophysiological measures with little kids. And I can look at ERP components that are associated with the same types of skills that we think are happening in the behavior, right? So I can both get behavioral measures on accuracy and reaction time from all of these, which is great, but I can also look at ERPs that are happening while kids are engaged in these types of activities. And the idea behind this is that we might be able to see some things happening in our ERP data that we might not be able to catch in behavior. So it's another level of individual difference that we might be able to look at. In my work, I look at children's error monitoring, so both processes of cognitive control, how kids respond when they make an error. And I also look at how they respond when they see the picture. So when you initially see these fish, what do, right? What does your brain do when it immediately is trying to make that quick decision? Okay, so I just highlight this because I think it's important for us to have a really good understanding of, we talk about executive function as being really relevant for kids' performance in school, but it's not always clear sometimes what we're talking about. And each of these different levels of measurement gets us a little different piece of that puzzle. And one of the ways that we know they're each telling us something different is that my behavioral measures on these same tasks are not always super well correlated with what's happening in the brain, right? So I think this is important for us to think about, especially in development, because what kids present with might not necessarily reflect what's actually happening 100% of the time underneath the hood. And this is just an example of that. We conducted a school-based study at through the University of Michigan. We have another one going on right now. It's a longitudinal project. And in this study, we looked at kids at the beginning and end of the school year. These are kids who are in kindergarten and first grade. And these are just their ERPs in response to a basic go, no go task. So we're looking at what happens when they make an error on a go, no go task. And this red line is what happens when they err. And in this case, it's small, but negative is up. And the green line is what happens when they get something correct. And what we expect to see in little kids, even though it's less pronounced than it might be in adults, is an error-related negativity effect. So when you make an error, immediately after having made that error, we see this negative deflection in your ERP data that gives us a sense that that error, even if you haven't registered that you've made it, has processed with you. Okay. So what we did was we looked at kids' error monitoring both at the beginning of the year and at the end of the year, and we were interested to see whether or not that at all related to changes in their behavior across that same academic year. Because again, we know that during this window of time, there's a ton of behavioral change that's happening too. And what we found was that there were indeed relations between change in that error monitoring process across that window of time, that 1 year of school, and change in attentional control as measured by this pair cancellation task. What's interesting, though, is that there were a ton of individual differences in this change. And what this suggested to us as we started to unpack it basically was that children, even though you wouldn't expect them to, were making strategic accommodations within the task. So our ERP data was telling us one thing, and our behavioral data was telling us something slightly different. When you talked with the kids, eventually, what they told you at the end of the day was that even though they were engaged in a very basic go, no, go task, very kind of, for us, we would never be strategic in it because it moves quickly and it's pretty easy. When they did the task the second time at the end of the academic year, the kids were like, oh, I got this. I know exactly how to play this game, and they're trying to game the system a little bit. So in this case, again, our repeated measures kind of might be clouding some of the things that we care about in longitudinal change, but it's also interesting to think about how it is that the things that we're measuring in the brain that we think are really important might be related to the same types of behavioral measures that we use all the time. So we do see some overlap, but not completely. It's important to note also, though, that in our ERP data in the same longitudinal study, we found some nice associations between what's happening when you engage in cognitive control. We look at those ERPs and your motivational processes, and also your academic achievement. And this seems to be particularly true for kids, again, who are struggling or right at grade level. Kids who are doing really, really well academically, we don't see as much engagement in these kind of cognitive control processes on our basic tasks, but we do see it more so when kids are kind of right there at grade level or a little bit below. Okay. So again, we think of these things, these skills are changing pretty rapidly during elementary school. And so the question is there an impact of school experience on children's development? If we go back to school and we think about what's happening, this is a kindergarten classroom again. This is a little bit more of a first grade classroom. She looks very engaged right here, very engaged in this reading activity. Even though I think people talk about kindergarten as the new first grade or the new fifth grade or whatever we talk about it as now, there is still a difference between what's happening in kindergarten and first grade, and in turn pre-K to kindergarten to first grade. So at each of these different transitions, we might expect that context is actually also imposing on kids something slightly different, right? So many people have tried to leverage this idea by using the school cutoff design. And we've done this in our work using two different methods, either the classic experimental method of the school cutoff, where you follow kids throughout the school year in both kindergarten and first grade, or pre-K and kindergarten, or what have you, or using regression discontinuity methods. So the same idea applies, though. What we're doing is we're leveraging the date of the school cutoff. In Michigan, where we've done a lot of this work, December 1st is the date. In theory, this is the date that the state decides your child has to have their birthday by to go to school. There are some slops in that, but we try and control for that in our analyses. So in theory, what you have are a group of kids who are in kindergarten, who are the oldest for their grade, and they're the oldest for their grade, and they might only be a week apart in age from kids who are the youngest first graders. So although these two sets of children are almost identical in age, what varies is their experience in school. Okay. So if we're looking at something like children's height, we don't necessarily expect that kids will get taller as a function of being in school. We wouldn't necessarily expect that on average in the US. So we don't see any effect here of the birthday on height as our example. However, if we look at other types of skills, including some very basic literacy skills, we see this gap in performance. So kids who are in kindergarten are underperforming kids of their same age, essentially, but who have experienced first grade. We attribute that difference to experience in school. Okay, so it's a quasi-experimental technique. And again, like I mentioned in reading, we have some really nice examples of how this plays out for certain skills relative to others. We have the same thing in mathematics. We've had more recent studies where people have actually looked at executive function skills in the same type of way. So we would expect, for example, reading is being explicitly taught, math is being explicitly taught. But we also think, again, that some of these skills are being shaped by experiences in academic settings. And so we see that as indeed the case. And this is just a small sample from a paper that we are about to put under review. That's a review of school cutoff studies in early childhood. And we see both for cognitive flexibility, attention, inhibitory control, and working memory, behavioral effects of experience of being in pre-K. We also see behavioral effects on experience in kindergarten and working memory. And we see neural impact in terms of attentional measures as a function of first grade. And that's, we've seen that in our regressions continuity work, and others have seen that using school cutoff technique. We're gonna hear more about that later on this afternoon. So this idea of school as impacting kids' brain and behavior is an interesting one, but this tells us very little about what's actually happening in the classroom. It tells us something broadly about just going to school, which in and of itself is kind of a massive change, right? So if you're going to school relative to just developing over time, not in a learning environment, there is something unique about being in school, and also unique about particular grades and stages within school that matter for certain types of basic cognitive skills. Okay. So I want to take us back briefly to life in an elementary school classroom. How many people spend a lot of time in elementary schools? A couple people. Okay. So I'm just going to quickly show us a clip, because I think this will ground us a little bit. I want everybody to pick a kiddo and follow them for this brief period of time that we're going to watch it. This might be the easiest way to do it. Hang on. I'm just going to end my show really quickly because that'll be the fastest. We'll also note I was just back in North Carolina for several weeks. You'll hear these kids talking. It's a phonics-based lesson. You may or may not understand everything that they're saying, because there is definitely a lot of accent happening. Let's see. Oh, where did it go? Okay. Let's do it this way. Here we go. Hand. What's the word? Hand. If we put a D on the end, we would have hand. What would that be? Hand. Very good. Very, very good.
So watch what's happening with each of these kids. Pick one that you like to follow. Think about their
So
engagement.
now it's time to talk about a new sound. Are y'all ready for a new sound? But before we get to our new sound, we might as well get a little exercise. So stand up. This is our signal. Stand up. Watch me really, really, really closely.
Seeing some differences here in the tiptoeing.
The first thing you're going to need are your O and I vowel sticks. And Miss Harvey put them out for us. So put one up, put your octopus in one hand and your itch in the other hand. And sit in your chairs like active listeners, and let's see which table is ready to go. I'm going to say a sound, and I want to see you put that sound in the air. Are you ready? Show me the ah. Show me the I. Show me the I. Show me the ah. Show me the ah. 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 I. Ah.
I don't know if this is tricky for you. It's really tricky for me to hear the sounds, but they seem to be getting it. Okay, so that gives you a sense of the type of activity you might see in a kindergarten classroom. This is a reading specialist coming in and doing a literacy-themed activity with these kids. So what are some of the things that you noticed if you were watching individual kids as they transition through this activity? So everybody's engaging their executive functions in this type of thing, right? They're kind of figuring what the directions are, they're trying to attend. But what types of differences did you observe in what the kids were doing, if any? So if we were to watch again and see, for example, what was happening here, this guy right here, just as an example, was looking a little bit around to his friends to figure out like what else, like oh wait, okay, so this is the one I'm picking up, this is the one I'm picking up. As we transitioned from the floor to the table, we also saw a lot of difference in how the kids were engaging there, right? Like their speed to do it, whether or not they were kind of still off in the corner. One friend was just really taking his time. Actually, I believe it was the same guy right here, taking his time to get back, right? So there's a ton of individual differences here. The other thing that you notice in these types of activities is that kids are doing a lot of social referencing, right? And social referencing is really critical because it's not just what the teacher's telling you to do, it's also what your friends are doing around you, or not your friends, people who are reprimanding your behavior as well. So if you're working as a group, your friends might be also telling you what you need to do to be on the right track, right? So you're getting a lot of information and feedback from your environment. This is much more dynamic than what happens when you're working just with me on a basic working memory behavioral assessment, right? So working memory here is knowing, okay, she says now we're going to move quietly from here to there, and now we've got all these different things that we're doing. I need to know exactly what the routine is. That's working memory in this context, but it's also in the face of all these other distractions and potentially also this excitement of raising your hands, which for some kids is probably far more exciting than the actual activity that they're doing, and probably all that they're doing and not necessarily listening to her sounds. Okay. So if we go back, let's just start again here. So one of the things that I'm really interested in, and I already kind of gave you a link between what we see in our neural measures and our behavioral measures, and that's a complicated picture in and of itself. But one of the things that I'm particularly interested in is what's happening with kids in this setting, right? So sometimes we see these beautiful correlations between executive functions and children's academic achievement, and sometimes we don't. And so part of what I think is happening is that how kids actually use these same types of skills in the classroom is a little different than how we're conceptualizing them in a lot of lab-based work. So when we think about EF in context, we have a lot of other things that we need to consider, including teacher and peer effects, the affective states of kids. So, in terms of teacher and peer effects, one of the things that we've been looking a lot is persistence and motivation. And tomorrow morning at 9:50, one of my students will be talking about some of our work where we're looking at this. What we know is that, for example, young girls are more likely to persist and attend in a task in the face of an adult than young boys. So we see individual differences in this that obviously also might play out in the classroom. Affective states matter a lot. It's hard to disentangle. I gave you at the very beginning this hot and cold EF. It's really hard, especially in early childhood, to say that this is just basic attention without thinking of all the other affective things that are happening around you. So if you're having a really great day and you're really excited, that excitement could really pitch you to being better at attending or focusing or harnessing your executive functions. But it could also drive you a little bit over the edge, right? If it's too exciting, you can see a level of dysregulation that can occur. And if you're having a really tough day, if you've ever worked with a kid on a bad day, you know that you're not going to get the same level of performance. So a classic example for me was working with a child who had just gotten in a fight on the bus. He had a busted lip. We're doing an assessment, and all he can think about is what already happened to him before. What we were getting was not a true measure of his skill. The same thing happens in the classroom day to day. And the final thing is child by instruction interactions. Carol isn't here. Carol Connor isn't here today. But she and Fred have done a lot of work on child by instruction interactions. And the idea that emerges from this work is really just that different settings may be more challenging for learners with difficulties in EF, whereas other settings might be better, right? So individual children need different types of things from their environment. We see this in literacy. We can also see it play out in different ways. As a result of that, we have tried to figure out how to measure executive function in a group setting. And we actually have some great measures. And I'm not going to go into as much detail in them here, but I'll just give you an overview. Again, tomorrow morning at 9:50, Sami Ahmed is going to be presenting each of these measures in great detail and the validity and how they work out with other academic skills. But just as an overview, for each of these same types of things that we're seeing in our behavioral measures, we can also look at them in a group context in the classroom setting. So we have different games like the marching game, a freeze game, and a jumping game, which are all kind of the basic types of games you would play with kids, but they're a little bit more structured so we can actually code what kids' behavior looks like. And from these games, we're getting information about basically their accuracy and reaction time and performance, but they're doing it in the classroom context with the friends around them. And so what we find, and this is again just kind of overlaying some of the data that Sami will be presenting tomorrow morning, is that these are reliable and valid measures of children's executive functions, but one game actually doesn't give you one skill. What one game gives you is a hint at one of the aspects of each of these executive function skills. Because again, like I said before at the beginning of the talk, each of these types of executive functions that we care a lot about are actually happening embedded with all the other things, right? So you don't have working memory going on necessarily without response inhibition, for example, in the context of an everyday activity. So what we find is that we can disentangle some of these basic constructs using these behavioral measures in the classroom, but that they also tell us a little bit more information about what's happening as EF relates to kids' academic achievement. So it gets us kind of closer, or one step closer, to thinking about how it is that EF might be impacting kids' performance, both how teachers are perceiving their performance in the classroom, but also their academic achievement.
So the final thing that I want to kind of talk about here is that since we know that school experience impacts children's executive function, we know that there's something different and unique about how it's measured in the classroom. So this isn't giving us the exact same story as our behavioral measures are. Leveraging that, we want to think about, well, what is it in the classroom specifically that's actually causing the changes that we see in individual children's performance, okay? So this takes us to the final level of thinking about how we can actually integrate what we know from our lab measures, from our neural measures, and actually take that right into the classroom and try and understand and disentangle these individual experiences for different kids. So the question of the final section is, how does experience in school shape EF growth for individual children? And we have some hints about what it is in the school setting that really matters. Although we don't necessarily have all the answers yet, I think that we have a much more fine-grained understanding of like literacy instruction and the things in literacy instruction that really matter for kids' development. We're getting there with executive functions. So some of the things that we know matter include teacher language during instruction. This comes from work that I did with colleagues at UNC Chapel Hill. We're examining how teachers talked to kids while they were just engaged in everyday academic activities. And we're particularly focused on the use of open-ended questions and provision of strategic information. And that could be related to academic content, or it could be related to behavior. So for example, you might have some teachers who are more likely to help kids kind of think through what their process of solving a problem or engaging in the right type of behavior or whatever it is that they're expecting the kids to do in the moment. And that style of instruction where teachers are really engaging kids on basically thinking about their thinking matters, particularly for kids. Actually, this is now under review. Particularly for kids that are struggling to regulate themselves. So something about having that social interaction in your environment and a language around how to regulate and how to think and how to learn really matters. We're not the only ones who have found this. We also know from some of Carol Connor's work and Fred's work that individualized instruction, including time in transition and time spent in certain types of activities, also matters, particularly for kids who have difficulty with self-regulation and executive skills. And then the final thing to think about for us is classroom structure and routine. When you're in the classroom, there's a lot of variability. I work in one school right now where many teachers don't have any schedules for the day. And so you see a lot of kids making these transitions, and some kids are on it, and that's really great, and other kids are like completely lost. These types of external structures and the ways that the classroom is flowing really matter, particularly for the kids that are struggling with developing that kind of regulatory skill on their own. Again, trying to think about things in the classroom that are offering that practice or affording that practice for kids. So in our most recent work, which we're engaged with now, we're actually taking our electrophysiological measures right into the classroom, and we're using the same type of idea. This is very early stages, so this is about as extensive as we're going to get on it, but I want to tell you about how we're thinking about it just to give you a sense. So in the child by instruction interaction work, one of the things that they do regularly is they'll take kids that are at varying levels of ability. So you might have kids who are struggling readers right in the middle, and kids who are high-performing readers. And what you're looking at is what they're doing in the classroom at any given moment and the types of interactions they're having around activities with their teacher and that type of thing. The same model can be applied to thinking about self-regulation. So the idea here is that you're taking children who are struggling with executive function, kind of right in the middle, and then kids who might be considered by teacher rating kind of overperformers on this regard. And then we're going to look to see what are the different factors for individual kids that matter, both in terms of their behaviors we can observe, but also in EEG data. And so we're using these remotely amplified caps. Obviously, this is a little messy. This is a mock-up. There's a lot of technical issues to work out here. But there are two main aspects of ERPs that we're focusing on with respect to this type of look that we're trying to map back onto some of the types of things we've been doing in the lab. Because one of the goals is to see, A, can we do this? The answer is yes. And B, what kind of information can we get from the classroom that is still, like how does it map on to what we're actually seeing in our laboratory-based studies. It's also worth noting, actually, I say laboratory-based, all of the EEG work that I've done with kids is actually in school, but what we're really doing there is we're pulling them out of classrooms. So the contrast here is that we're trying to do the same type of thing embedded in everyday activity. Okay, so there are two main things that we're focusing on here, including the novelty P3, which is a robust ERP component that we can examine. It's linked to executive functions in children, cognitive control processes, and it can be elicited by novel and unexpected sounds. So just as we might have a behavioral assessment in class, which we've done before, where we have somebody novel come into the classroom and we have a loud bang going on and we see how long it takes kids to get back on task. The goal here is to use that same paradigm, but in a much more controlled way, and look at ERPs associated with those types of events. So if you hear a door slam, right, how long does it take you to get back on task? We can observe that, but our behavioral measures aren't super good at capturing individual differences here, but we can look at ERP components that are related. We're also looking at oscillations, oscillatory patterns in alpha, and in particular, alpha power decreases and power fluctuations across time windows of instruction. And the way that we're thinking about this, actually, so here we have classroom factors we're experimentally manipulating. With our EEG data, we're looking at different basic aspects of activity type. Are you sitting at the circle during circle time? Are you doing independent group work, for example, that we can code and link that coded behavior to time periods that we can then look at alpha? And then activity duration. One of the basic questions that we have that's actually something that I get from educators a lot, which sounds kind of silly, is how long can kids sit there for? This is one of the ways that we hope to start to address these types of questions by looking to see, can we see patterns in alpha fluctuations that might reflect what's happening in attentional processes for kids. In the novel TP3 work, we're actually relying a lot on adult cognitive data and other general behavioral and ERP studies we've done with kids as well. Think about those constructs. With our alpha work, we're actually looking a lot to the ADHD literature to figure out what are the types of things that we might see happening in kids who have struggles with attention, and can we apply those same types of ideas to what's happening in the classroom. Okay, so if we take that same model and we think about looking at ERP data by individual kids. So say you have a child here, this child looks very focused. I'm very impressed by this kid. If there's a loud noise, he might look away or he might be disengaged for a moment. We would expect that not to really impact him as much as potentially this freshman who obviously already is looking around and doing his thing. So the idea is ultimately what we'd like to do is figure out what types of classroom supports can be put in place for those children who are really having difficulty with that focus. And also in converse, is this child actually, if the child's not looking to be engaged, but they actually are listening. I think we've also seen this happening at circle time. You have a bunch of kids sitting around and there are kids that are really still doing this number, but they're really excited and they're engaged and they're actually paying a lot of attention. We're trying to kind of flip that idea, really disentangle behavior from some of the processes that might be happening in the brain. Okay, so ultimately, our goal is to kind of bridge each of these different systems. I showed you a little bit of an example of the behavior to brain just for the behavior and brain that we pulled out when we were actually working with kids one-on-one. The goal is to kind of do this full model, but in the context of the classroom. And we'll see how far we get. Everybody is welcome to participate in this. If anybody wants to help out or be a part of it, we encourage that. Right now, we're actually doing this type of work at the lab school at UCLA. And so we'll have more of that coming up this year. But it's small steps toward kind of this bigger goal. And just to end, I'd like to thank all of my colleagues, both at UCLA, University of Michigan. There are a lot of people on here who haven't been listed that have been helping out with this, and also appreciation for participating teachers, students, and families who actually make this work happen. If you don't have schools that actually are willing to let you come and do some of these things, it's almost impossible to do it. So we owe all of it to them. And that's it. Yeah, sure. I'm happy to take questions. There's kind of like a lot of different things covered in that talk. If you would like to unmute yourself or text, we can also address questions that way. Yes.
This is something I don't know too much about, but I'm just wondering, other types of EEG components, when you're looking at alpha, but are you looking at other sides? I've heard before that theta is linked to creativity potentially. I'm interested in what you can get from these sorts of measures in the classroom.
There's definitely a lot that we can get. We're focusing right now on alpha in particular because of the really robust literature that we already have. Again, from studies with kids who have attentional difficulties and other measures. But there's obviously a lot of other things we can look at. we're just trying to hone in on something that we know we have a really good experimental handle on, and then take it back out into the classroom. But that's a good question. There's a range of other things we could look at for sure.
Jennie, do you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for great presentation. I really enjoyed listening to it. It's great. The one question I have for you, does a student's language and cultural background has any impact on executive functioning?
That's a really great question as well. I think that's something we know a lot less about than we should. I think there's a growing understanding of language processes. So I have some colleagues at UCLA, for example, who are working in the same school, who are looking at dual language learners and kind of the implications of that for the aspects of cognitive development. But the other thing to consider, which we also see, is that for a lot of children who are learning in two languages or learning in a language that isn't their primary one, there are a lot of other factors that come into play that make attending and processing information in the classroom really challenging. And that's actually an interesting next step, because I think that a lot of what we've been seeing, at least in our work at this school, is that it's not just the cognitive side, but also the emotional side of frustration, not necessarily understanding, being able to do the same types of activities because maybe you don't understand the directions at the same level. So trying to get kind of at more broadly what's happening for kids and moving beyond some of our behavioral measures, I think will help us get there. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So one thing that's interesting about most classrooms is just how busy they are, how much stuff on the walls, and it's just this idea of, let's stimulate it as much as possible, right? Like,
yeah.
Maybe they could speak to that. I've seen one study, it's more distracting.
Yeah.
Show that their alpha power is affected.
Exactly. It's an interesting question, and it's one actually that a lot of schools, because I work in a lot of different schools where teachers have very strong ideas about that. And so I've been in schools where people will proudly say, we have nothing on our walls. And at first I was like, oh, it makes sense because I'm familiar with this research, but I hadn't seen it translated quite as directly as that. And the same thing at the lab school that we're working on, they're actually really particular about how much stuff is on the walls because they don't like a lot of external information to kind of be influencing kids. So it's that, but it's also flow. These are large open classrooms where kids are actually given a lot of freedom of movement. And for some kids, that's actually really distracting, right? Because they have their peers and their peers are up and going. And some people are just fine and other people are like, whoa, it's too many people in and out of the room. So there's a lot of basic questions about classroom setup and structure that we can examine. And you can get at that behaviorally by trying to find who, but it's really hard to see for kids, we're kind of guessing as to whether or not it's impacting them or not. And so this gives us just another piece of data. But some of these very basic questions, I think circle time is the other one. People fight it out about how long kids can sit at the rug. And, the rule is their age +1 in minutes, which is actually a good rule of thumb. But when you're watching, you're just watching the heads fall. And it's 30 minutes in and I'm thinking like, whoa. But also from the instructional perspective, you're trying to get your message across. So how do you do that and balance some of these other types of goals too? It's challenging. Yeah. Okay.
Hello?
Yes.
Hi, I had a quick question. Following up on what you mentioned about the impact of kind of social emotional development and kind of other areas of kind of the way emotions and the social aspects of the classroom. I know that oftentimes when we discuss different types of disabilities, executive functioning deficits are just assumed to be part and parcel of an array of different disabilities and exceptionalities. And so I'm wondering when that is being discussed, how much of that, we do know that there are some that have that as a core component, like ADHD, but thinking about kids with emotional behavior disorders and autism, how much of that is also impacted then possibly by the social emotional environment of the classroom versus pure executive functioning in and of itself, if there is a such thing.
Yeah.
Sorry if that was complicated.
If I understand what you're asking, it's kind of whether or not, especially for children who are having learning differences, we can really disentangle executive functions. I think we do tend to talk about, oh, this child has a difficulty with working memory, and that's kind of a core deficit that they have. But like you're highlighting, it's actually really, really hard to disentangle these things, both in early childhood and as kids are moving through adolescence, right? So if you're having difficulty in the classroom or you're processing the world in a slightly different way, there are a lot of other things that are happening that are above and beyond your response inhibition that matter. And then how your peers are interacting with you or how you feel about yourself as a learner then really starts to kind of flood the system as well in ways I think teachers understand, but I don't think we've actually gotten in terms of data. We've gotten that far. I think people are starting to ask these questions, but I don't know that we really have the answers yet. One of our goals is not necessarily specifically to look at kids with ADHD. Many of the kids in our age range would not have yet been diagnosed, but to think about kids who are kind of having difficulties on the continuum, right? So for all children, you can offer supports in the classroom that will help meet their needs so that they can be successful in practicing or leveraging these types of executive skills wherever they're at. So our goal is kind of to think about, well, what can teachers do or how can we help teachers think about infusing their lessons with types of things that will help kids with that. All learners, but it definitely, the emotional side is really, really important. So yeah. I did not get her slides yet. Okay, so I think we'll transition now. I just need to get the data to put on here. Okay.
So this is, I can go.
Oh, okay.
Do you want to?
Yes, I don't know the top. Give us, oh yes, give us 1 second. For Zooming. Yeah. Do you want to take then the lead on the?
So what would you like to do?
It doesn't really matter. Whatever is, would you prefer to present from your computer or would you? Okay. So the only thing we'll have to do is log into Zoom from there as well. That's the only difficulty. I also have a Mac, so you shouldn't lose anything. Sorry about that. Okay. Here, I got it. Okay, give us 1 second. Do you want to do a quick introduction while I? Okay. Yeah. Just disconnecting real fast. Here you go. You're welcome. These new Macs with only one port makes it really challenging to do all of our things that we might typically do. Let me just close out of this and close out of this. Is it doing it? It should be. Let's see. It's giving us all time to check our phones and our email. And we should be set. Okay. I think we're in the most technologically advanced room and it's it's limited by my ability. Okay, so let me just make sure that I have this registered here and we'll just pull it off. I sure can. And we'll just go ahead and start that way. And let me just see. Okay, I think we should be set. And it should come up the right way, right? Ooh.
Every time I change it, it changes the light.
I was very excited for a second. I wasn't sure what's going on. It's like a real spatial effect. Oh no, I'm sure it's on my, yes. All of these things I feel like are just, yeah, okay. Uh-oh, now, oh, you know what I did? It's me. See, I told you. Human error. Okay, wonderful. And I'm gonna go ahead. Great. Okay, so just want to welcome Dr. Terry Jernigan, who's joining us from UC San Diego. And we're very excited to have her speak with us. She has a lot of speaking obligations at this particular meeting. So yeah, if you want to, sorry.
No, it's fine. So I'm going to take over, and I'd love to introduce Terry Jernigan. I've known her work in, and I'm sure all of you know her work. She's been doing decades of research in brain imaging, non-invasive neuroimaging techniques. And in particular, so I know her work, a lot of her work through development, but people have seen probably a lot of work through drug abuse and other areas of and aging, and pretty much I think she's done a number of whole spectrum of research in the past. I think you're trained as a neuropsychologist by training, so she is a neuropsychologist by training. But many of you probably know her from a lot of these multi-site national work, the PIN study, as well as the more recent ABC study. I don't know if you'll be talking about some of those multi-site major initiatives. So she might be touching on that today. And she's won many, many awards, and we are very delighted to have her. I'm sorry, I should have said this initially, but she's a professor at UC San Diego in cognitive sciences, psychiatry, radiology, as well as a director of the Center for Human Development. And then I think you're also co-director and the coordinating center for the ABCD study, I'm sorry. And let's see, so we are very excited to have you. I think you might be talking about somewhat different topics than what you would be as a keynote at IMBES. And I don't know where you might be talking about it, but maybe some of your work in the schools or developing the EEG systems that would be more scalable, perhaps. Okay, so I can't wait to hear what you're going to be talking about. Thank you very much, Terry.
And that one's actually synced. It's being tricky with how you forward, so it's all right.
So please join me in welcoming her. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Famiko. So first of all, let me say this was a spectacular talk by Jenny. I'm so glad I got here in time to hear, I think almost all of it. I think I walked in right after it started, and it was just fantastic. And it couldn't have been a better introduction to what I'm going to do, which is mostly pontificating, as I just said. In fact, I should probably just sit down now and leave everything just as it is, because you did such a great job of making a case that I thought I would need to make. So yes, as Famiko mentioned, I'm actually going to be talking at the keynote after this, later in the day, and there I'm really going to be talking more about the ABCD study, which is a large-scale study that we think of as being a good example of developmental population neuroscience. It's kind of the term that we're using to describe these studies. So I'm actually not going to talk much about that study. It's a large nationwide study of the developing mind and brain. ABCD stands for Adolescent Brain and Cognitive Development Study. So as its name suggests, it really mostly focuses on the adolescent brain. And it's a very high dimensional study, lots and lots of kinds of assessments done, for similar kinds of things, but for slightly older kids, and that we heard here from Jenny. And brain imaging and so on. So it's a large-scale study of the developing adolescent brain. But what I'm going to talk about today is a different interest that I have and that I share with the folks in the Precision Learning Network. And it involves an earlier period of development, and it involves sort of the interface between early childhood and formal education and learning in the context of education. And so I'm just going to talk about my own thoughts about a little bit about where we are, and unfortunately it was said much better by Jennie already, but also what I think we might want to consider doing to accelerate our progress. And I'm going to throw some ideas out here because I thought of this as a setting where I could sort of try out some ideas and get some feedback about these suggestions, about where we could go, perhaps, in a way that would accelerate the progress in our field. So maybe I should just, oh, and by the way, thanks for inviting me to join this symposium. It's a great opportunity for me to get some feedback. So I'm going to talk probably not for as long as I'm slotted, but that's because I'm hoping that people will actually give me some feedback and we can get some discussion going about the ideas that I'm going to put forward. So, okay, so clearly all of our work together, my guess is everyone in this audience, is interested in one way or another in the developing cognitive and intellectual functions of children. And by the way, probably interested in their developing creativity and their social emotional functions as well. But I'm going to talk a little bit now about the traditions that that we have in the different branches of this sort of multidisciplinary field. This is all probably well known to you already, but just to sort of juxtapose where we're coming from and where we might need to move together to collaborate. And let me say that I am coming from a very strong collaboration back at UCSD between education researchers, scholars and researchers coming from an education point of view, and cognitive neuroscientists and a group of, and some other folks from other disciplines as well. But in education research, traditionally the goal has been to develop and apply the most effective teaching practices for supporting these kinds of functions, cognitive and intellectual functions. And generally, in this research, one observes and focuses on the differences that result when practices vary. But I think most people in this field would say that they're sort of humbled, as we all are, by the observation that learning varies in spite of standardization of good practices and attempts by experienced educators to adapt to individual learners. So if you come from the cognitive neuroscience side, your traditional goal is to understand how these functions work and what factors influence them. But the approach has been more to observe and focus on the differences that result when external factors are held constant to some extent. Differences between groups when you try to control for other than diagnostic differences. Differences between individual children when you control for things that are considered to be in the noise component somehow. But again, I think what we've learned in cognitive neuroscience is that learning is highly context specific. It's closely controlled by the salience of material to the individual child and by reward contingencies in the environment. And it's also highly dependent on the learning history of the individual. So although there are some differences in how these issues have been approached, I think that both groups conclude that learning is deeply personal. And that's kind of why we think about things like precision learning and personalized learning and personalized education. So both education research and developmental cognitive neuroscience know now that they must pursue deeper insight into learning and the emerging cognitive and intellectual, as well as social and emotional functions. But one question I would pose is whether developmental cognitive neuroscience findings guide education research to the discovery of more effective classroom methods. Because you sometimes hear this argued, and I guess I am a skeptic about this. And so I would say that developmental cognitive neuroscience approaches are important, but insufficient. I think there's ample evidence that constitutional differences subtly influence the ways that we experience our environments, and that the effects of these subtle differences are likely to grow in magnitude over developmental time. So this is one issue. But almost nothing is known about the mapping of person-specific factors onto differences in classroom experience and subsequent learning outcomes. And so none of this knowledge is very much actionable in the classroom. So what are the implications of this? Well, it seems to me that achieving consistently good or consistently better learning outcomes in the context of formal education requires that we develop better models of learning in the classroom. That's what I'm saying. Classroom learning is not the same as laboratory learning. Therefore, the complex dynamics of classroom behaviors and environments must be accessed and linked to learning outcomes. And since multiple environmental and experiential factors outside the classroom and constitutional factors, and by this I'm talking about things like the status and pattern of a child's brain development or their personality, contribute to variability in the classroom, the research must also include measures of these variables. So together, educators and scientists really must first identify the strongest associations between individual differences on these multiple factors and variability in classroom experiences and learning. And then establish the degree to which manipulations of person-specific malleable factors exert actual influence on learning outcomes. And I've emphasized this exert actual influence because I think we must all really develop greater discipline. I'll get rid of this thing here. And I'm not pointing fingers. I think we all must stiffen our backbones and exert greater discipline, both in the education research and the developmental cognitive neuroscience literature, to avoid the attribution of causal influence of attractive, accessible associates of learning outcomes, absent the rigorous scientific evidence that we need that these associations truly are the result of mediating or moderating causal influences. This is just something that we all do with our eternal optimism. When we see associations that make sense to us, that these are the causal factors, we just have a hard time resisting thinking of them as kind of established as causal influences. Something I think we all have to do as a field better. In order to make progress on such complicated problems as we have to solve in this area, I think that we need a diverse coalition of investigators interested in improving educational outcomes, who can organize their efforts, set achievable goals, and collaborate directly with practicing educators to produce large-scale, high-dimensional data resources from which mapping of learning outcomes to classroom experiences can be derived. So I'm going to float kind of an idea. And for those of you who may come to the keynote address, you will probably see then, if not now, that the ideas that I'm going to float are heavily derived from my experience with these large-scale multi-site studies, and particularly with the ABCD study. I apologize for that, but it's a lot on my mind these days. But here's the idea. And again, this is what I would like to hear from people about. I think we need to develop a more collaborative approach within the science of learning community that'll accelerate our progress. So, emerging sensing technologies, including wearables for autonomic and neurophysiological data and actigraphy and all kinds of other things, advanced and less intrusive ethnographic techniques, and better computational coding and processing of high temporal density video, audio, and motion capture data can turn classrooms into live learning laboratories, I'm calling them, live learning laboratories. And they can do this, I'm convinced, while still respecting the important work that's going on there, which is absolutely essential. And I can assure you that it is possible for sophisticated anonymization methods to protect the privacy of the participants, the children, the teachers, the schools for that matter, and support data sharing within the research community. I think the use of such technologies could provide a foundational data resource for interdisciplinary teams of scientists in collaboration with educators and education researchers and scholars to use to discover how the experiences of students with different academic outcomes differ in the classroom at a deeper level. And then to identify possible moderators of these associations by factors that are measured elsewhere. For example, the status of a child's brain development, sociocultural factors, family environments, and so on. So here's this vision. This is just one vision. That's not the way we do it in ABC. It's not any one person's vision. We really bring all the expertise in our consortium together to shape the study and to solve every problem we encounter in the study, I can assure you. And that's what I would envision, but you have to throw something up there first and see how people respond, then you work on it. So I'm throwing something up there and I'm asking you to give me some feedback. So my idea is that a collaboration could try to help us move from creating observing classrooms, and that's what's in this, this is what I'm trying to say here. If I can that we can move over a number of years. This may be a little ambitious, but you gotta be ambitious, right? We can create an observing classroom. It's kind of what I was just talking about, this kind of wired up classroom, an observing classroom to an intelligent classroom. The idea of the intelligent classroom is a classroom where enough has been learned about some of the associations between classroom experiences and learning outcomes that one can begin to use that intelligence to see if there's a way to intervene intelligently at the person. So anyway, this is the idea. And how this would work is as a consortium. Let's say that it would be a consortium of 20 teams, just for the sake of argument, 20 teams. And I call these teams research practitioner teams. And I say North America because I don't want to exclude Canada. But just an idea that could involve 1,000 participating classrooms. So this tells you already that these research practitioner teams would have to be teams that included fully collaborative superintendents, principals, teachers, classroom teachers. It could be about 50 classrooms in each community. That's about how that would work. It would involve over 10,000 students, and they would have to be enrolled as participants, right? And that would be about 500 plus, somewhere around there, in each community. It would involve passive data collection of the type that I was just talking about. So passive data collection in the sense that a lot of information hopefully would be collected in different data streams from the classroom and anonymized for analysis. And it would also involve passive data collection from the community. In ABCD, we collect a lot of information about our participants' communities from public databases. We get information about the crime statistics in their communities, how much stress and chaos is there in their communities. We get information about exposure to air pollutants and risk of lead exposure and things like that. So this kind of information about some of the community variables, and of course, not just the negative ones, some positive ones as well. Do they have lots of youth programs in their neighborhoods and so on? You can often get from a passive collection from public databases and learn more things about your children's environment. And of course, it'd be a battery of behavioral and performance assessments, very much like the ones that Jennie described. And I think that's, again, would be sculpted by the participating and collaborating scientists who have a lot of expertise in that area. And of course, there would be brain developmental assessments, imaging, but also EEG methods, be very important here. And we would collect additional developmental, family, and cultural assessments to complement these classroom and other environmental measures. And this consortium of research practitioner teams would be serviced, so to speak, by a coordinating center that would do some of the things that the coordinating center for ABCD does, and helping to organize all the communication and help to give logistical support to the scientific work groups, set up all those myriads of teleconferences they have to set up. You guys know about that. There'd be a data analysis and informatics center that would help to pull all the data into a central place where it could be monitored by the consortium experts for quality. And not only QC, but additional, data processing could occur there. And my view is that such an initiative would require a couple of extra core teams, data scientists and technologists, because it's very ambitious, both from a data science point of view. It would produce terabytes of data, many terabytes of data, and it would be ambitious from a technological point of view. So just a word about these research practitioner teams. I'm almost finished with the talk. Again, keying a little bit off of what has happened in ABCD, the teams would include leading researchers, in my mind, from the science of learning disciplines. But this would be broadly defined, because many people, many disciplines have relevant knowledge and expertise for something like this. But for example, teams might be some people from developmental psychology or cognitive science or cognitive neuroscience or pediatric imaging or education researchers. Certainly leading educators and education scholars would be on these teams. And they would all be researcher and scholar teams that all had already partnered, that were partnered with collaborating district superintendents, principals, teachers. In other words, really people like the people in the larger IMBES community, really. These kinds of multidisciplinary teams in the communities. And a word about the classrooms, just to flesh this out a little bit. One idea would be to start with these classrooms. So there's 5 different levels here. And if you did that, if you signed up, so to speak, you had schools that were willing to open up their classrooms across this grade range, you could do this with as few as 5 to 10 schools per community, or 100 to 200 schools altogether in the consortium. And this is, you guys don't know this, but this is a knockoff from the ABCD consortium structure, which I'll present tomorrow. But it's changing it to being 20 communities instead of the ABCD research sites. And although we have a coordinating center and a data analysis and informatics center in ABCD, this one it has these additional cores. And this is just to start the other kinds of entities that you would need to, and there are others, but these were a few that I thought were obvious, to be a part of such a large-scale collaborative effort. You would need an external advisory board, always very helpful, to pick people that you want to hear from them frequently, and you're willing to pay them for it. an ethics and policy board, or it could even be an ethics board to policy board. I think this is, you know, the kind of thing, but you certainly want to, in doing something this large, to have a lot of input from people who know a lot about the ethics involved in doing such a study, and keep close tabs on the ethics in the consortium. And obviously there are important policy implications to this as well. A national liaison board would be critical, which leaders at relevant institutes and federal partners and people who would be able to help to help you to communicate with the wider community of stakeholders. And certainly in ABCD, this is critical, this kind of stuff. So just some idea, just give you a sense of what form it could take. And again, this is just throwing something up against the wall to see, you know, what resonates. But I guess I really feel that moving in this direction of having more, sort of more integrative and strategic direction in the field, and help and trying to work together to make the results more definitive by scaling them up to some extent, by collecting the necessary foundational observations that are, I think, really important for developing better models of the complicated phenomena, the complicated outcomes that we're interested in. That, you know, movement in this direction would be highly beneficial. And, you know, I also think that in doing this, the data sharing, the fact that the community would have these data resources to share, they'll come at it from very different points of view. I've learned that time and again with Ping and with ABCD. People will come with incredible questions that nobody else would have thought of, and do really interesting things when they're able to share these kinds of data resources. I think this is a huge benefit of doing it in this way. And so, I'd be interested now to just hear what people think about doing science in this way, what they think about the, you know, and believe me, these are what probably should best be called ruminations on my part. So I'm happy to hear that they're just crazy. Many of my ruminations are, so I'm not sensitive about it. So, you know, but I'd like just to hear what people think. Is this something that you think might be a good idea? Can you have any questions about how it might work? Or not that I know, of course, since we never did it. But I'm going to stop there because I just wanted to throw that out.
To Fumiko for getting us started with Prequel, right? Yeah. Prequel. Okay. Yeah. So I haven't been involved yet, but I'm really, really excited to get involved and get to know all of you. Okay. So this is my lab right here at UC Berkeley. And one of the questions that preoccupies us is about higher cognitive functions and how they're shaped by experience. And there's this kind of hypothetical plot that's pretty commonly used. And the theory is that we know about plasticity of different brain systems, and the period of greatest plasticity is when a brain system is still maturing. And so we know quite a bit about sensory plasticity and motor and language plasticity, and quite a bit less about higher cognition. And the way that this is graphed out, we really just have no idea about the limits of it, how long it goes on, and whether there is even a sensitive period. So in our lab, we try to probe the plasticity of higher cognition, and there are various ways that people do go about this. One is with, as you know, very focused, targeted kill and drill kind of computer programs. Another one is with video games that are more engaging, more multidimensional. Then we can look at studying for a specific course. And finally, something like the experience of graduating from college or something like that. So at one end of the spectrum, we have very targeted, well-controlled kinds of studies of the kind that cognitive psychologists and cognitive neuroscientists like to do. And on the other hand, we have really multifaceted, ecologically valid, but messy in the wild kinds of studies. However, people who do research on brain plasticity, even going back to work in rats, argue that you have the potential for more widespread plasticity in these kinds of cases. And so I'm very much more interested in this end of the spectrum, and the work I'll tell you about today is focusing on effects on higher cognition of taking a specific course or completing a specific grade level or degree. Okay, so I'll first tell you about a study done in collaboration with collaborators about what happens when you go through grade 1. Next, I'll tell you about what happens when you take a specific course on deductive reasoning. And finally, what are the longer-term effects of having completed higher education? So when it comes to primary school education, people talk a lot about school readiness. Is my child ready to go to school? Does he or she have the right executive functioning skills and social emotional skills to be able to start and do well in the classroom? But we can also think about the other direction, right? Does the act of going to school itself change the child's brain and somehow hone brain development? And if we think about the transition from informal to formal schooling, you go from a situation like this where you've got kids playing together in a group, doing fun stuff, to having to sit still in this kind of a scenario, right? Sit still, pay attention to the teacher, don't do anything else. And so the question for us was whether the increased demands on sustained attention and inhibitory control that you see in the formal classroom setting actually are driving cognitive and neural changes in these systems. And how can we test this, right? Because we can't randomly assign children to either stay in kindergarten or preschool their whole life or go into grade 1. This was a study conducted at the Max Planck Institute in Berlin, led by Yili Xing, who was at the time at the Max Planck, then went to Sterling. She's actually now back in Frankfurt, in Garvin, and Professor Ullman Lindenberger. Okay, so how does one go about disentangle these effects? And Jennie Sure talked about this. We were very much influenced by her work, as well as Fred Morrison's. And so you can do this school cutoff design, where you have children who are roughly the same age, but by virtue of regulations, they end up having their, ending up in school earlier or later. And so this was done in Berlin, where they have a hard cutoff of January 1st. But in fact, some parents actually cheat. And so you end up with some kids who are a little bit older who end up in school earlier and vice versa. So in this study, we were able to collect behavioral and brain imaging data both before and after kids either went through grade 1 or stayed in kindergarten for the academic year, and they were roughly the same age, and the distributions overlapped a lot. And we were able to get some data on measures that had nothing to do with the school curriculum. The first of these is a well-known test of executive function called the Hearts and Flowers task. And in the easiest version of this task, you see a heart appear on the screen, either on the left or on the right, and you have to push on the same side as the stimulus appears. Then there's the incongruent condition, where you have to do the exact opposite. So when a flower appears, you have to press on the opposite side, and this is pretty challenging. And then the diabolical version of this is when you have to switch back and forth between the two rules. And so we looked at how going through grade 1 might change performance on this test that requires sustained attention and rule following. And we found a nice schooling effect here. And I'm plotting it for you for that incongruent condition where you have to press on the opposite side. These are the kids who go through school pre and post, and it's a larger effect than for the kindergartners. However, we actually saw improvements on all 3 of the conditions, even the easiest congruent task. And so we argued that there was just a general improvement in sustained attention and rule following, and not any one component of executive functions. And the data I'll show you next also fit with this. So we looked for effective schooling on a go, no-go task. In this case, you see pictures of dogs, pictures of cats, and every time you see a dog, you press because you take dogs for a walk. You don't take cats for a walk. And what we found was that in terms of accuracy, neither the school group nor the kindergarten group improved differentially, and they both improved over the course of the year on the GO trial, so they got better at pressing for the dogs. They were not good at not pressing for the cats, and they didn't get any better. Schooling had no effect there. However, we wanted to know whether there was still a schooling effect on brain activation, because they performed this task while they were being scanned with fMRI. And so we were interested particularly in the lateral frontoparietal network, which we know is important for sustained attention and executive functions. And we looked on the GO trials where they were fairly accurate, and we looked at just a mean effective time. So across all participants, did we show any changes in brain activation? And what we ended up finding within a frontal parietal mask is activation in a right parietal lobe region across kids. And when we looked at this region, we found that it was actually being driven by the kids who went through school. And in fact, they were now above baseline relative to the fMRI baseline, which they were not before. So going through school engaged this part of the brain that, based on reverse inference, there's evidence that it's involved in sustained attention. So this is pretty neat. But this is puzzling. Why do we see the schooling effect in the brain, but not in behavior on the very same task? Okay. Is it that the fMRI is a more sensitive measure of the underlying change than performance on that particular task, which we developed in the laboratory? It's not standardized in any way. What we did find is that the increased parietal activation in this go-no-go task actually correlated with increased accuracy on the other task, on hearts and flowers. Not an amazing correlation, but it is there. And to us, it suggests that there may be some underlying component neurally that is changing, that is at least manifested in some way behaviorally, if not on that task per se. And then the question that really intrigues me, and we've been seeing this in the literature from other people's studies as well, this mismatch between behavioral effects and brain imaging effects. And could it be that we're finding a brain signature that is predictive of the growth of attention skills, or more generally behavioral improvements? Is it that we're sort of showing the first glimmers of something that's changing that could eventually translate into behavioral improvements? And so I think that this is one of the promises of neuroscience, is to see if we can predict who's on the cusp of learning something. And actually, I wanted to give a shout out to Fumiko, who was the first to really start to get into prediction as a really important aspect of the way in which neuroscience can influence our understanding of education. Okay, so some broader questions from this first study. What is gained in the transition to formal schooling, and what is lost? What do we lose by moving away from this informal play-based kind of approach? And secondly, to what extent can normative cognitive maturation, those of us in developmental psychology or developmental cognitive neuroscience, we like to plot trajectories of growth and memory and executive functions and reasoning. To what extent are those actually influenced by the particular educational context, history of the children that we're studying? And so I would love to see more cross-cultural research comparing educational systems across countries and even across states in the US. All right, so the conclusion of this first study, we do find some evidence that going through grade 1 improves sustained attention on tasks that have nothing at all to do with the course curriculum. In fact, these kids didn't even have access to computers in the classroom. The second is completely different. Now we're going to young adults who are taking a course on deductive reasoning. My lab has done a lot of research on this topic. We've used a number of different kinds of tasks to see which brain regions are active when you're doing reasoning. And based on our work and others, we found a set of brain regions that's consistently activated regardless of the specifics of the task. And I'm not going to go into detail about them here, but in particular, this inferior parietal lobule region and this rostrolateral prefrontal region, particularly in the left hemisphere. And so some years ago, my former grad student, Allison Mackey, who's now a professor at Penn, and I were interested in testing whether going through a course on reasoning could actually influence, could strengthen connectivity between these brain regions, both functionally and structurally. And so we were looking around for some sort of, ecologically valid experience in which people are attempting to improve their reasoning skills, and we settled on the law school admission test. It heavily taxes these skills. Students are extremely motivated. There are many test prep books and courses out there. It's a big, big industry, and about 150,000 adults prepare for it every year. Does it change them? So in this first study, we took pre-law students who were about to take a course, pre-law students who had not yet started studying for it. And we followed them over 3 months. In fact, all we did was do pre-test and post-test assessments, which I think is something we need to go beyond in future research, which I'll talk about in just a second. We measured behavior, brain structure, and function. As I said, I'm not going to talk much about this, but we did see both strengthened resting state functional coupling between these parietal and frontal brain regions, as well as changes in the white matter microstructure measured with DTI. And when they were taking this blueprint course, they had 100 hours of class time, of which 70 were devoted to reasoning. All right, I'm just gonna skip over all of this stuff because I wanna get to the behavioral work. So we had a test of reasoning, a test of transitive inference that had nothing to do with what they were doing in the LSAT, and I'll show you some of the LSAT stimuli later on. But in this case, you see a set of 4 premises. These are balance scales, and you have to decide which of these 2 balls is heavier. And to do that, you have to identify the relevant set of balls, the relevant scales, and you have to integrate them to decide that, in fact, this purple ball is heavier. So that's a test of relational reasoning. And again, nothing to do with the LSAT, but what we see is the students who went through the LSAT showed a nice improvement in accuracy as well as response times on this task that the controls did not. These controls were very well matched on multiple dimensions. Okay, so I would argue that this is moderate transfer. The LSAT problems are all verbal. They're completely different from this visuospatial task. We did this task in the scanner, and the main thing that we found was that the students in the LSAT course, they showed a decrease in activation in dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So that's fine. You know, we know a lot about dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. It's basically active whenever you're doing something difficult. By reverse inference, we could conclude tentatively that, you know, that the task gets easier for these people right after the course, but it doesn't really tell us much about the mechanisms of change. And so we wanted to look beyond fMRI and use eye tracking, and unfortunately my video doesn't work in the transfer. But we have this exact same paradigm of the balls, and we're interested in measuring people's eye gaze as they go through the task. So why eye tracking? First of all, there's a tight link between where you're looking and what you're attending to. And eye movements are actually the fastest movement that a human body can make. And in the 7 seconds, roughly even up to 15 seconds, that it can take us to solve one of these balance scale problems, people are making on average 23 eye movements. So it's a much richer measure than just getting accuracy at RTs at the very end of the trial. Okay, so this is work from my former grad student, Belen, and it was just recently accepted a couple of days ago to the new Nature journal, Science of Learning. Okay, so this is the study design. We got behavioral and eye tracking data at one time point, then they studied and got the same things again. But this time, instead of having a passive control group who didn't do anything in particular during the intervening time, we actually were able to randomly assign students to take one of 2 sections of the course. And so one group was assigned to practice the logic game section, and the other group, the reading comprehension section. These are 2 subsets of the test. And so they had the same amount of time, roughly 33 hours over 6 weeks. And importantly, the courses were very well matched. They were all administered online. They had videos that involved the same teacher, and they had workbooks that they had to practice at home, and neither group was allowed to do anything other than study for their own section of the test. This is an example of a logic games problem. So what you have is a problem where you have to integrate a number of rules to figure out logically which of these answers is correct. It's a tough problem, and people learn all kinds of strategies to solve them. They learn to identify the type of question they're being asked to answer, and they learn to diagram them out to just simplify this very complex set of questions. Okay, and so then we looked at transfer of this kind of practice to tests of relational reasoning. These are spatial tasks now. You might recognize some of them, but in any case, we had this set of 4 tasks, and we created a composite reasoning score, and we were able to show that the reasoning group showed an improvement and the comprehension group did not. We consider this a test of moderate transfer. It's not near transfer, it looks nothing like it, but it's also not something completely different like working memory. So in terms of their performance on this transitive inference task, accuracy was at ceiling, unlike our previous work. And so what we're looking at is probability distributions for the response times. And so the way that this works here is the probability of seeing a particular response time. So for example, here, this is the probability that a trial has a response time that's under 10 seconds, right? And so that's already at like 0.7 or something like that. By 15 seconds, the probability is nearly 100% that the trial would have ended by then. And what we find in the reasoning group after training is a leftward shift of this curve, such that especially for the longer response times, we're seeing those getting tightened up after training. We don't see this as much for the comprehension group. They show a trend. We used Bayesian statistics. This is not showing up at all. I wish I were using my own computer, but the Bayesian statistics showed a strong effect of time and a weaker effective group by time interaction. So not super strong evidence for training specific effect on response times. We still wanted to go ahead and look at our eye tracking data. And in particular, we had 3 different ocular measures that we were interested in testing. So the first one was, could people be improving their ability to visually search this complex array? So what you have to do first to solve this problem is identify the 2 relevant scales. And so people move their eyes around, and we look at how many fixations they make before they settle on these 2. The second thing is relational thinking. Once they've found the relevant scales, how long do they have to spend on each one of them to extract the relevant information? So relational thinking, where they're encoding one, going to the other one and thinking about that one, and then coming back to this one. And then we had a more selected measure of relational thinking, which was just how many times they had to look back and forth between these 2 scales, okay, before they integrated them. Okay, so these are the changes in the measure that showed the most robust changes. It's that measure of relational thinking, which is how much time they spent examining the relevant scales. And so you can see here, we see a robust effect of schooling in this measure, which is that the reasoning group had to spend less time encoding and thinking about these relevant scales. So these data give us mechanistic insights into the transfer of learning from these kinds of verbal problems to these non-verbal problems that are pretty common tests of reasoning. And they tell us that some form of transfer is explained by changes in relational thinking. It's getting more efficient. So as I mentioned, I would love to extend this kind of work where we were just talking about black boxes and black holes, and we do in our world, not in the education world, we do treat these educational experiences as black boxes, and we're just measuring stuff on either end. And I would much rather that we at least break down the black boxes into smaller ones where we're looking at different pieces of the curriculum over time and getting not only these accuracy and response time measures that are summary measures of performance, but also other measures like eye tracking, ERP, etc. Okay, so we argue from these data that taking an LSAT prep course improves relational thinking, even in as short a period as 6 weeks. We have no idea how long these effects last, but I think it's kind of interesting to be able to look at that. And the last piece of what I want to tell you about is at a bird's eye view. This is not an experimental study, but this is what happens when you've completed higher education, even if you completed it 20, 30 years ago. Does your history of educational attainment influence, first of all, your current cognitive functioning and also your learning efficacy? This was a study again with my former student Belen, and we had help from a data scientist at Lumos Labs, and we got the data from Lumos Labs, but we have no commercial interests with them. They were very generous in giving us their data. All right, so the reason for looking at this is I've long wondered about these kinds of data. This is a measure of broad cognitive ability across multiple measures over a broad age range from the beginning of life to the end of life. And you see this massive improvement through age 20, 21, something like that, and then it starts to come down. Many cognitive abilities peak in early adulthood and then begin to decline after that. And so why? And could this decline be related in part to completion of schooling? Is it that most people, after they finish their college education, most of the types of people who end up in these kinds of studies, they finish their college education, they take a job that will never again demand as much of them as they had when they were studying history, math, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So if this is the case, then the age at which you reach your peak cognitive functioning should vary as a function of when you completed your schooling. Right? So if you completed your schooling around college, then yes, you should be showing this kind of peak and then downward trajectory. So we were interested in studying this, and it's very, very hard to do this, to get the kinds of causal data that you want, but I'll show you the approach that we took. Our participants were Lumosity subscribers, mostly in the US, but also Canada and Australia, and we had 200,000 of them across multiple ages. And they completed a cognitive test battery online with 8 different tests that are versions of things that we all can recognize from the neuropsych test literature. And importantly, 70,000 of these subscribers completed the assessments 2 times before and after 100 days of playing Lumosity games. I'm not interested in the games per se, but the fact that there are 2 time points, and so there's opportunities for test-retest improvements in addition to any kind of games you might see related specifically to playing these games. And so we were able to test for the effects of your prior educational attainment on both your current performance on these 8 tests, as well as your gains from the pre-test to the post-test. We controlled for multiple factors, and household income didn't alter the results at all, but gender, ethnicity, native language, and hours of Lumosity altogether accounted for a very small percentage of the variance in our results. So we basically were able to break down the categories into PhD, master's, bachelor's, associates, some college, high school, and some high school. And this is their grand index score, adjusting for all the other demographic variables. And this is just age groups of 5 years, 5-year bins. And what you can see here is a very systematic difference in cognitive performance as a function of education. And unfortunately, regardless of your level of education, so here we've got PhDs, you're going down at the same rate as people who didn't complete high school, okay? So the effect of education across this large age range, 15 to 60, is substantial after controlling for a lot of other things. If you compare PhD with some high school, you get a large effect size, a moderate one for bachelor's versus high school. But of course, there's a chicken and egg problem here, right? You can easily say, but Sylvia, people who go on to get a PhD have stronger cognitive skills than people who don't. That's absolutely true. And so we wanted to try to get around this a little bit. And so we zoomed in on the period when students are in the process of completing their education. So this is what that looks like. And so once again, the grand index score over age, but now ages from 15 to 25. And now you see something interesting. These are not parallel lines, actually. They seem to have these kind of peaks and then drop-offs. And we were interested in looking at this because at age 17, there are people who haven't completed high school yet. There are people who have completed it, and there are even people who have started some college, right? And so at that time point, it's interesting to see that there are no significant differences between them, but they start to diverge over time. Importantly, these are cross-sectional data, right? So that's, you got to take that with a grain of salt. But what we're interested in is, can we see any difference in the peak cognitive functioning. So for 17-year-olds, without a high school degree, do they tend to peak around age 17, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what I'm showing you here. This is the age at which, for a particular educational category, the age at which we see peak cognitive functioning. And you can see this beautiful transition or pattern essentially that fits with this idea. Okay, so in terms of the typical ages of graduation, we don't unfortunately have that in this data set for these folks, but for typically across these 3 countries, USA, Canada, and Australia, people graduate from high school around age 17. That's around here. That's peak cognitive functioning for high school. And they graduate from bachelor's around age 22. That is right here. Pretty nice. And then they vary a lot more in terms of when they get their PhD, et cetera. Okay, so the second thing I wanted to share with you is the results of the pre-test, post-test games across the 100 days of gameplay. And so who improves the most? Is it the people with the highest education or the lowest education? And there are really 3 plausible outcomes here. The first one is that the lower performers, who were the ones with less education, those who were lower performing at the outset have more room to improve on these tasks, of course. The second one is that through education, you learn to learn. So you get more efficient at actually learning something new. And the third one is these games have absolutely nothing to do with what you do in real life. They have nothing to do with the education you achieved, and especially not education that you completed decades before. So who thinks that the lower performers at the outset would improve the most? Okay. Who thinks that the ones with the highest education would improve the most? Okay. And who thinks this has no relevance to education whatsoever? We have a lot of undecideds there. So it turns out that there's a really negligible effect of prior history of educational attainment on this learning efficacy, which is the test-retest. So that is the change score. And you can see that you're still seeing this systematic effect across the levels. It's a very principled effect, but we would never have picked it up if we didn't have 70,000 people who had tested at 2 time points. And yeah, so, just not there. And I think that that's kind of nice, right? You can learn something new regardless of your prior education. Okay, so, all right. And there are some open questions that I think are relevant to Preckle. One is, why do we keep seeing these changes in brain activation and also changes in eye tracking? And Helen Neville has shown this with ERPs as well. Why do we see these kind of physiological changes without behavioral improvements? What does that mean? Is it that they're more sensitive? Is it that they predict future behavioral change such that if we were to stick with it, we could see those changes eventually? What types of experiences and at what ages are we most likely to see long-lasting effects on higher cognition? And one that's personally interesting to me is, will we learn more by studying these kinds of complex, messy, real-world educational experiences, or the kinds of narrow, tightly controlled ones that those of us from the cognitive science world are used to conducting? And the last one is eye tracking really a viable approach for monitoring learning over time in the classroom? And we can come back to this question of whether kids would be open to having their eyes monitored as they're performing tasks on a computer screen, or even when they're wearing mobile devices and looking around at the teacher and at the blackboard and at their computer, etc. Okay, so open for questions. I wanted to leave a fair amount of time for that. And thank you to my funders and also to the families who participated.
I have a very basic question, which I know I'm missing something, but I missed it somewhere, where you have these graphs and PhDs in different degrees, a number of them. And I think you were saying that the age of peak, so we'll just take an example of the age at peak of cognitive ability. So, but you can't measure those with PhD before they get their PhD. So you start from a point where they know there's a
exactly
PhD program.
So they're in that age range, so we don't know if it's what's going on at age 15 or 17 or 19.
That's right. I mean, you could get your PhD as early as 27, but that's right.
So it's possible that there might be more of a range in these people before the time that they
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I think these results are really interesting. I'm just wondering if you might be able to comment on some of the vocational aspects as well that might, let's say, influences that would lead someone to enroll in an LSAT course or subscribe to Velocity, something like that.
Yeah, great question. So we picked the LSAT because, as I mentioned, people are very motivated, and all the people in our studies, even when we randomly assign them, they're planning to take the LSAT course, and we're giving them access to one of these courses for free. And they tend to be pretty motivated. The ones who aren't drop out, right? When it comes to Lumosity, people sign up for Lumosity for various reasons, either because they're worried about their cognitive functioning or they think it's fun. And yeah, so I can't really say much about that. I don't have data on these 200,000 subscribers, but I think, if it were, I mean, at different points in the spectrum, like the 60-year-olds are probably much more worried about their cognitive functioning than the younger ones, but we see these effects of education throughout that age range.
I'm also curious about occupation.
We do.
They learn actively throughout their life.
Yeah. Yeah, we do. We have really broad strokes right now. So we just know they were in healthcare, they were engineers or whatever, but healthcare could be a doctor, could be a receptionist, could be anything. And so we've now asked them to put in a much more detailed assessment of profession. So yeah, so they're collecting those data now. And one of the interesting things for me is this question of whether you start out, if you're smart, you start out with fairly broad cognitive skills, and as you spend more and more time in your profession, you maybe lose some of that and you become much more specialized. Yeah.
You look at brain behavior associations more broadly, it's a lot more common, I think, than we assume. So if you take something like adolescence, lots of changes going on long before you see over behavioral changes, something like Alzheimer's in particular. But I think what you may have found is something really more profound that than just what's a more sensitive measure. That in fact, brain learning may actually not be, coincident with behavioral learning. And the more exciting possibility is that there are individual differences in that connection. And so I think finding methodologies for exploring this could be really revealing about not only, what experiences are having an effect on the brain versus behavior, but whether the individual differences.
Yeah, I think that's tremendously exciting, and I really love the link that you're making to both Alzheimer's and adolescence. It's wonderful, and I'm just thrilled that at some point in life I'll have that opportunity. Let me rephrase that. I hope that at some point I'll have that opportunity to follow these people up and see, are they on the cusp? Are they the ones who show the strongest parietal lobe activation? Are they several months away from showing improvements in the classroom, let's say? And same thing for the eye tracking. And that's the reason that I have pursued eye tracking, is to try to look at this over time. But I'm interested in everybody's thoughts on that sort of approach. Yeah.
Do you think it could be, and maybe you brought this up, could it just be that they're using different strategies?
They meaning
So
the,
differences at the brain level.
Yeah. Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And so if we're interested in specific cognitive processes, we might be missing the boat when they show, no change in terms of accuracy and response times. Yeah, absolutely. So that's part of what I mean by more sensitive to the specific cognitive functions that we're looking at. Yeah.
Harking back to your psychological science paper, when a parent decides whether to get their child ahead or to hold them back a year, is that driven by differences in the children that you can measure? Or have measured, or is that mostly telling us something about the parent?
Yeah, no, I know. And I'm very interested in that question. I get that a lot. Like, hey, so should I hold my kid back or not? You know, so we don't have data on that. Our measures, they don't differ at pretest, which is nice on our own measures. Yeah. Yeah.
You can't discern anything different about these kids that would influence the preference.
No, but at the same time, they may be having different levels of support at home that could be influencing this as well. And I think a larger scale study should definitely look at that. And I don't know, Jenny, if you've looked at this.
So we have in our larger sample,
Mm-hmm.
again, it's like the measures that we have
Yeah.
around the anecdotal stuff. So when you talk to parents, they always have some story about, well, my son, and then fill in the blank.
Yep.
And it's hard to say, I don't think we're measuring that super well. Right?
Yeah, we're gonna say that too, but it's a pretty substantial.
You're Fred. Wow.
Yeah.
Awesome.
That essentially says that parents, by and large, they hold the boys back. And the reason they tend to
Sports.
do that varies by social class.
Hmm.
So essentially, higher SES parents hold their boys back, like redshirting, okay, because they know they're going to be stars, but they look a little young right now. But the lower SES parents hold their kids back because they're just worried about failing.
Interesting.
The evidence, though, if you look across what the variables are that predict, it's really not social maturity per se. It tends to be general measures of cognitive ability. So if you are, in fact, low cognitive ability and young, then you're going to struggle. But other than that, those other variables don't predict too much. And the evidence suggests that entrance age per se tends to fade out in reading by about second grade and math by about third grade.
Right.
So if you look across the predictors, it sort of just disappears.
Yeah.
Pretty soon. But in fact, you're right. Basically, parents don't listen to any of that because they just don't want to take a chance with their young boy. So you're still going to get those questions every year.
Yeah. So the other approach is to ignore those rule breakers, right? And just look at those two groups that follow the rule, and they have a slightly bigger gap in age, but it's still just a matter of a couple of months around the breaking point. And our data look the same that way. But these are all really interesting questions.
Do any of these studies account for differences in ethnicity? Because we talk a lot about parents holding their boys back, but in my experience working with Asian parents, they're trying to get their kids in earlier because they want them to finish faster.
Yeah.
So have you looked at that at all?
Yeah, so our Berlin sample, it's all white middle-class kids, but I'm sure that these folks can speak to that.
Sort of actually, we were talking about exactly.
So in the experiences that I've had working with Asian parents, they're not holding their kids back. They're trying to get you to put their kids ahead. So have there been studies that looked at differences in ethnicity and when you're talking about, do you factor that out when you're looking at it? And I think you addressed it by saying the studies have focused mostly on
this was just a convenient sample. We weren't doing that on purpose, but yeah.
No, there haven't actually been the appropriate, scaled up studies of ethnicity in the United States. There's a rather large literature on cross-cultural differences between Asian and American kids. And it sort of shows the same picture, not necessarily that they're pushing them ahead, but they're very, very focused on achievement. So, typically over a lot of different data sets, Asian kids from first grade all the way up to 11th grade are outperforming American kids.
And I wonder if that's because at the schools that I've worked at, I mean, in kinder, their kids go to school after school. So they're in school twice the amount of all the other kids. So when that impacts it, that's where they're out.
Yeah, that's partly it, I think, but I think Silvia and Jennie probably have one really big answer that in say, Beijing or Tokyo, it's very, especially in China, they really start school-like activities at 3. And so they call, 3-year-old, 4-year-old, 5-year-old classrooms preschool. And there's a whole lot of ordinary practice training of self-regulation. So their kids are way ahead of the game by the time they get to the same age our kids are. So yeah, there's a kind of primary facie evidence for the school.
Also a cultural one could argue.
Oh, of course.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
All right, so you have the slides.
I can sing for you all. Okay, nobody wants that. Let's go ahead and I'll go ahead and let me pull this series of talks up. We've got, it's so tiny on the screen, and here you go. Not yours. There it is. Okay, great. And we can do presenter view for you. And actually, if you use this advances it more easily. So you're set to go. Okay, so we're ready to go, everybody, with our first of the student data blitzers. Here we go.
So hi everybody, my name's Annabelle Castillo, and today I'll be talking to you guys about executive function skills among early language learners, bilingual and monolingual children. So executive function is a really broad term for a collection of processes that are interrelated and responsible for making goal-directed behavior. Up until about 50 years ago, there was a popular belief that exposing children to another language could be potentially harmful and the child would display mental confusion. This notion was actually challenged by Peel and Lambert in 1962, where they did a study looking at monolingual and bilinguals. They compared them on IQ measures, and what they actually found was that bilinguals outperformed monolinguals, and they actually showed enhanced cognitive flexibility. This work has been built upon for a lot of years, and we've actually found that bilinguals have better inhibitory control. They're better at working memory tasks, especially when those tasks are primarily based on executive control. But yet there also, more recently, findings have been mixed, with some studies not finding this effect. And additionally, there are few studies looking at this question longitudinally. So how do bilinguals and monolinguals develop their executive function skills over time? So one of the aims for our study was, do bilingual and monolingual children differ on their growth trajectories of executive functions? And we also were wondering, how do these findings extend to English language learners? We got a data set, the Early Childhood Longitudinal Study Kindergarten class of 2010, and in order to assess it, to look at this question. So we have a total of 7,096 monolinguals, 522 bilinguals, and 229 English language learners. We have direct measures of executive function, and our measure of cognitive flexibility was the dimensional change card sort task. And we also have the numbers reverse, which is like the digit backward span, which was our measure of working memory. We also have indirect measures, which were teacher reports based on the subsets of the CBQ and the social skills rating system. Teachers were asked to rate children on inhibitory control, self-control, and attentional focus. And just to give you guys a layout of the age and the time points that we used, kids were given the direct measures: fall of kindergarten, spring of kindergarten, fall of first grade, and spring of first grade. And the teacher reports were fall of kindergarten, spring of kindergarten, and our last time point, which was spring of first grade. And we implemented latent growth curve modeling in order to look at this question. So first we compared monolingual and bilinguals, and then we compared monolinguals and English language learners. We had two time invariant covariates, which were SES and SEX. And this is just to give you guys an illustration of the path models. So before I actually jump into the results, given the length of time, I'm only going to talk about the direct measures that we have, but the teacher reports were actually really interesting and quite different than the direct measures that I'm about to show you guys. So if you guys have questions or want to come check out my poster on Saturday, I'd be happy to talk more about this and really unpackage those findings. So for cognitive flexibility, we found that monolinguals and bilinguals did not differ at intercept but over time, bilinguals did increase significantly faster on cognitive flexibility. English language learners were significantly lower at the start of kindergarten, but they increased significantly faster over time. And for working memory, we did not find any differences with monolinguals and bilinguals, so at intercept or over time, but English language learners, again, were significantly lower, but increased significantly faster over time. So our study suggests that bilingual and monolingual children are different in some ways, such as their rate of change, cognitive flexibility, but given our study, these results, it's not a substantively important group difference at the final time point. And these findings actually corroborate previous findings which looked at preschoolers and kindergartners. They did find a difference with bilingual and monolinguals at the first time point. So a reason why we might not be seeing it, since we are testing the kids a little bit older, could be that it could just become harder to detect these differences because there's a plethora of confounds that are really hard to control for. As kids get older, they're engaging in a lot of different tasks that could be also enhancing their executive function skills that are difficult to control for. But I think a really important takeaway that I want to leave you guys with is that the English language learners were consecutively lower, but when they became proficient in their second language, they improved significantly faster and they ended up catching up to their peers. Thank you guys for listening, and thanks to my collaborators.
How do you think these tasks flow differentially on the sort of demand for English language proficiency?
What do you mean?
So, like Hearts and Flowers, give instructions in English operations are kind of free, but like digital background span, give the actual stimuli in English, the response has to be in English. And as you change your English proficiency, that might impact these two tasks differently.
Oh yeah. So what I didn't have time to mention was that these were Spanish speaking, so they gave the task in Spanish. So it was probably like uno, dos, tres, and then repeat those backwards in Spanish. But I do know that there is some literature when they look at, like they add emotions to the dimensional card sort task, and they do find the kids perform differently.
Do you think if you follow these kids farther out, that you'd start to see some other differences emerge? That maybe you just are not capturing the differences?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I think that me and my collaborators are always, they're faster, but yet they're ending up the same. So this data set does actually have 4th grade and 5th grade data out, so hopefully we can get to that question and see if there are some differences later on with these same people.
Did you want to unpack for us those other results that you didn't have time for? Or
yeah.
Go to the
So we actually found that the teachers rated bilinguals at their first time point being significantly better on executive function skills. There was no difference with the English language learners and monolinguals. And I thought this was really interesting because it might be, teachers might be picking up on something more hot executive function. And there is work by Zoe Lieberman, I think at UC Santa Barbara, that actually looks at monolingual and bilinguals, little kiddos like before 5 years old, and she finds that they're actually better at social cognition. So there might be something there. I'm interested in it.
What's the social cognition? What kind of social cognition?
So she gives them like almost a theory of mind task where they having a conversation with maybe a 2-3-year-old, and I'm saying, I'm putting this red truck over here, but the other person doesn't. They take into account the view of the other person. Bilingual children do a lot better than the monolingual children.
There's a new meta-analysis of bilingualism and fear of mind that just came out. The only reason I know is we were just about to submit it and then we found it. But the results were consistent, so we were really happy about it.
Thanks.
All right, great. Thank you very much.
go. So come on down. Let's see. I think I pulled them up from, I found them, if that's okay. Does that look great too? Yeah. Okay, great. And you can go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself while I make sure that this
Hi,
is
good
good.
afternoon, everyone. My name is Yu Zhang. I'm a postdoc researcher from UC Davis School of Education. And I will present this Spencer project study about special education and low English proficiency on behalf of our team. And our PI, Professor Jamal Badi, is still online, so you can forward the question to me or him. So we look at the English language proficiency. Those ES students always be misclassified as have the learning disabilities. In some of the studies, we found that students with EL students, they have low performed, and these overpopulations, California and like Wisconsin, Michigan, they were misclassified and thought they have the language-related disability, for example, the speech impairment and the communication barricade. And in particular, for this sampling, we do not have a very strongly instrument and tools tell if they have these English proficiency problems or they should be more supported by this IEP program. So the purpose of our study is to find a more reliable and valid assessment to measure the academic, language, and other performance for ELL with our LRD. These terms is what we use for this project is language-related disability. For example, to know how the low performed on some specific content areas is attributed to their cognitively or linguistic or other barricades. The data collection, this is still ongoing, a little bit additionally work, because firstly, we try to know some of the performance of 4 subgroups, for example, ELL with LRD, without LRD. So know some of their basic performance level, their standard test score, but because of the new ELP students still ongoing is testing, we do not have this specific data. So this data collection has happened, and I will present you some preliminary findings and outcomes of this field test. Some theoretical framework. So this is a diagram to show how we're going to approach the data and come up with the finally outcome is to the methodology to discern the content performance and the English language proficiency. First is the measurement issues come up with the ELP and the content for English with special learning disability. And this over identification and some of school district and the California under the state levels give us some of the rationale to provide a very valid tools and assessment. The criterion we're going to select is going to address a lot of the factors or modifications going to account for the methodology materials need for both native language speakers and English language learners and non-English language learners. So target samples, we provided a couple of like the overlapping of different population. Actually, the purpose of the study we're looking at is this overlapping very small size of samples between the low English proficiency and the IRD, because the identification of different students was going to be taken charge by different groups of teachers. For example, the first one teacher is going to working, and EL teachers, bilingual teachers, going to working and assisted them in the EL program. For the next part of the picture showing the speech pathologist, they are looking for a student with language disability, for example, have this like dyslexia or speech problems. So they can tell from specific groups or refer them into the special education. But usually the numbers of students pull out each year are pretty minor. When the bilingual students going to tell the story, they will pull out 1 or 2 and finally decided by the school board if they should be referred or not. Research questions, I quoted directly from our big research overview. So it's a little bit broad. Let me narrow down a little bit. It's from this specific data collection. So we collected data from 2 states, Wisconsin and California. Like I mentioned, this was overpopulation, which is to say they have relatively large EL population and they have a relatively smaller accommodation to keep them. That's why they are very highly rated to be referred to special education. And our study tried to contain them and measure them more fairly to decide where are they going. Briefly to say, from the preliminary, the gender, ethnicity, and the SES, those features are quite representative of the whole California and Wisconsin. So we suppose we have a very good control on that part for these demographic factors. And this benefit is also very useful for us next step of data analysis. So the field test for reading and mathematics with some samples, we doing both tests for these 943 students. Reading test used is a cognitively distinctive test. Actually, it's useful used to distinguish between the students with learning disability or or non-disability. And math, we're doing some work on creating specific math test to be more descriptive with the 4 groups. With, for example, to distinguish the English proficiency cognitively. I use this cross arrow to show you the 4 quadrant. These 4 actually 4 types of question. Either very high on linguistic challenging, very low on linguistic challenging, or highly mathematical challenging or low mathematical challenging. So they match and make a matrix. We're supposed to use them to find and identify or help the students of ELL or EL with or without LRD. So show some of the demographic information. Like we said, the NSLP students actually have medium to low SES. 60% of them have been enrolled into the NSLP with free reduced lunch or partially free reduced lunch. The proportions of disability, very large of the population, they have no disabilities. So what we were looking for, it's very narrow. That yellow one is students with speech and language impairment. So this is very generally data collection. We're collecting all of the students across the generally classroom. And the last proportion of accommodation is for the EL program. For 85 of them have no accommodated. So only 20 of them have accommodations. Some preliminary data of the finding, the 4 groups, they are not so specific, significantly statistically, but the ranking and the comparison is pretty easy to tell. So we still find the EL with non-LD is highest, but something very interesting we find is non-EL with SD, their math and reading get the lowest than the other 2 groups. So some descriptive findings of the mean value, SD and T test for math and for reading. For math, compared with those 4 groups, we find some specifically differences with ELL, non-SD, and non-ELL with SD. So math seems more descriptive, but reading is the only thing we find is the two groups with SD and without SD. So we didn't find something. Okay, 1 minute left. So maybe just skip to these parts. Last parts of the data to show is we have some regression, try to predict if some factors going to work or they have been predicted to the outcomes. So we use the ELP, reading, and NSLD, and some standard test score going to be added as well. Because it's still ongoing, we didn't find any strong predictors for the increased math and reading test score. The data collection is still ongoing, so we're going to investigate it more SPEC, ELA, and our standard test score. And the second, we found that mathematics and reading is still very powerful tools. It's still on refinement, and developing those data are going to inform how we created this rubric on this linguistic and content level complexity and to measure the 4 groups of EL and non-SD. The only thing we found a little bit deviated and different from assumption is non-EL with SD. It seems the lowest across the 4 groups. On the other side, the EL students with SD especially doing very well. So this is this is something we didn't encounter. Just assume from the experience that EL students from the EL program, they are more intervened and accommodated. So these specific trainings may be helpful for their performance, especially in the grade 3 students. They are major samples and very young. So these are our general findings. Okay, thank you very much. Let me know any questions. Yes, please.
Could you unpack how you measured and conceived of math of these measures out? And could there be a subset in math that would overlap significantly with Raven's type of processes?
That's a really good question. We didn't find some like interactions to say this math. For example, the EL student do very good in math, but very poorly on Raven because of this like language barricades becomes more like stretching out. So this is part we're going to look at, but currently we didn't find a lot of like very confounding variables or this interaction with these two with these two specific tests. And look at these patterns, they are pretty similar. So still the non-EL with SD, they perform the lower than EL with SD. They are very mediocre and not so like low, like poorly showed. So for the Raven, we didn't see another parts of the data. We look at psychometry and reliability. Raven test is pretty like, it's very easy. Their discriminative level is very low, which is to see, for example, 80% of students, they ranking very above the average. So we didn't think Raven is actually something confounded with them. But these parts, we do use 2 levels and like 2 features to look at them. One is linguistically and the other is math. So we think these parts, they can tell some difference with their language and or their content, but not Raven. I think Raven is much more to tell like the learning disability, but not language. That's my idea. Okay.
There's a question from Elizabeth. Elizabeth, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, please, that would be great. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so my question was, and it may not be specifically answered by your study, but just any knowledge you have of this, how much is this over-identification grade specific? I know from my experience as a teacher and now teaching and working in teacher ed programs, there's a lot of reporting that there's an under-identification and that students aren't English language learners are not being looped into the informal response intervention, but then also the special education process because there's a push to wait until they've mastered English. And anyone who's worked with English language learners, particularly in the elementary school years, knows that to master English at an academic level can take years and years, and some students, unfortunately, without even more supports, don't always get there. So I'm wondering, is the overrepresentation and kind of what you guys are seeing as far as learning disabilities and English language learners, is this a specific to certain grades, or do you feel like this continues to be a trend within areas that have high English language learner student populations?
Okay, I try to answer all of your questions. First, this is quite important question. The ELL, they are on this, from Isabella on this monitoring effect, they were doing much better than others. But because they are pretty young, if they are middle school students or high school students have this performance like emotions and have this cognitive functioning, I will fully agree with you that this might be the immediate effect and we should follow up and look at more closely in other ways. But grade 3 students, they are too young to understanding our purposes. And this is just one of their very generally administered tasks across all of the ELP, their content. So they really treated, I have to say, fairly to doing their best and doing this test. And from the Ravens, again, use the reference evidence, they're doing pretty well, which is to say they have these general general levels. For the English language learner, the students, we do not have the information how long they have been involved into the EL program to say if they're over 1 year, we can see, yes, maybe your hypothesis is correct. But for the grade 3, I guess they'll no more than 1 year. And for the young students in EL, if they're cognitively supported by the bilingual by the EL teachers, give them more, not only just the content knowledge supports on math or English, but more accommodations, give them support emotionally or cognitively support to say, hey, you can do very well, you are the same as the others, and doing your best to exit from EL, then you can go to the regular classroom. And this might be the hardest motive, and the reason could explain some of my data to say the EL here is doing much better than the student with the SD. And this is also the rationale to see how much this test or assessment could be powerful. If we can, it is like the literature we just mentioned, we have a very good system for both the teachers' intervention, RTI you mentioned, but not all of those was just towards the students with learning disability. If they found that they couldn't get this kind of help, but EL, they barely could have these supportive and broadly instructional accommodations. So we designed this a little bit complicated test is to be sensitive enough to tell no students in ELL, even with or without learning disability, they could be accurately either pull out or added or referred. So that's something we find and reply to your questions. So just a bit more objectively, I do not think the students really get this a lot of cognitively they were challenging, but emotionally they are not so much actively or responsive to the teachers. So, but this is the directions we will be working on to find the result.
All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, so can you just do the front slide maybe, just to go back? All right, so thank you very much for staying online. For those who are remotely, we've had about 20 groups call in, so this has been great. And we are almost at the end. And as I told you at the very beginning, I was going to introduce our new co-director, Melina Uncapher, who will be closing this symposium. So Melina Uncapher, as many of you may know, she's an assistant professor of neurology at UCSF. She's also joined the Preckle group this year and has taken over as co-director after my move. She also leads and directs the Education for Neuroscape, a new center that bridges neuroscience and technology. She has a PhD from neuroscience neuroscience of memory from UC Irvine, and she spent 16 years doing more basic type research and now applying that to the science of learning and contextualize it in a more educational environment, as well as using technology. So she also leads the Multi-University National Science Foundation. That's going to end tomorrow. Isn't the last day tomorrow? So end of our third year is tomorrow. A lot of our co-PIs are here. Bruce is here. I'm here. And it's ending. Even though it's ending, we have a lot of rich wealth of data. So we'll be analyzing and using some of the Preckle resources over the next year. So we're very excited about this. And this network studies how executive function contributes to academic achievement. She also leads an initiative to launch learning engineering as a new way to build research practice partnerships. She's a busy person, like many of you, all of you. She co-founded and CEO of a nonprofit called Institute for Applied Neuroscience, which arms educators and students with practical tools based on learning science. And I could go on for a long time, but I want her to close and have enough time, so thank you.
I actually have no business doing the closing. This is Fumiko's